Yeah.
Yeah, I could. It might just be easier to like see what's coming up. Hey, how are you? Yes, residency hearing and all that good stuff. I also have yours on here. Hey, Shelly. I'm Christine. We met a couple years ago. Nice. Good to see you. Good to see you. I was never excited to see you. All right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone.
Whoa, you're so official today.
We are we are using a microphone because we are actually live streaming to other administrators who are back at their building. So hopefully they will be able to hear us, and I guess we'll keep this a little further away so we don't get the screech. But thanks everyone for being here this morning, and I want to thank Jim Plascota and Katie Lyons for our lovely, incredible wellness smoothie bar. How about that? And Carrie, and Carrie. Um, I wanted to introduce to you a couple of members of our legal team from Franzik. We have Shelly Anderson and Emily Tellick here with us today, and we'll be going over three important topics. We're going to begin today's with our Title IX training and updates, and we'll be going into evaluations, and then we'll be doing investigations and difficult conversations. I think all really important topics just to keep top of mind at the beginning of the year. Hopefully you don't have to use a lot of the negative things in these, but we need to have that information in the event that we encounter any issues. So at this time, I will hand it off to Emily.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Tellick, and I'm going to be talking for the next about 90-ish minutes about Title IX. I'm going to preface this presentation with the fact that we're going to go over a lot of definitions, a lot of the regulations for Title IX. What I really want you guys to get out of the training today is just recognizing when you should be bringing conduct that you hear about, conduct that you see, to your Title IX coordinator, to an administrator, so that your Title IX team can really make a determination as to the best way to address the situation or the conduct. So keep that in the back of your minds. Please feel free to ask questions, but I know we'll get a little bit bogged down in some of the definitions, so don't feel like you need to memorize this all today and be making these decisions as you go forward. So why are we here? We're here to talk about the Title IX regulations, but we're also here because in August of 2020, the Department of Education issued new Title IX regulations. This kind of came at a time when I know you guys were dealing with a lot. So it, for some people, got a little bit lost in the shuffle with COVID and remote learning, but we're going to talk a little bit about what the new rules require under Title IX. And we're also going to talk about how to recognize Title IX sexual harassment, which is going to be a little bit different. If you have worked in Title IX before, it might be different from the Title IX definition you were working with earlier. Or it might be different from state law definitions of sexual harassment or some of your policy definitions. So we're going to talk about what the differences are there. And then we're going to talk about how to take the right action, right? So again, your focus is really going to be on ensuring that you're recognizing this conduct when it happens and you're reporting it to the right individuals so that they can make the determination as to what policy we're going to use, whether it's Title IX. So just making sure that you're able to recognize those situations when they do come up. Why is this so important? I know you all know this better than I do. You're with your students every day, but I have some statistics up here with respect to why this is so timely, right? So 1 in 4 women experience sexual assault before the age of 18. 10% of children are targets of educator sexual misconduct before high school graduation. 48% of U.S. students are subject to sexual harassment or assault before graduating high school. And in 2010 to 2011, 36% of girls, 24% of boys, and 30% of all students grades 7 through 12 experienced online sexual harassment. Given that, only 23% of all sexual assaults are reported to police. And if you're thinking what I'm thinking, this really doesn't add up, right? We're having a lot more sexual assaults, a lot more reported sexual assaults than are going to the police, or maybe that are even being reported to you guys. So what we know is there's this big underlying problem of sexual assault, particularly in our schools, or sexual harassment in our schools. And how do we address that appropriately, right? We also know that harassment and assault can have really long-lasting detrimental effects, both on students and on employees. We're going to talk about today how Title IX applies to both students and employees. So that means if you see or hear about student sexual harassment, we're going to talk about where Title IX falls. But also if you as an employee are experiencing sexual harassment that might fall under this Title IX definition, you're also going to be covered by this. So keep that in mind as well. These are just some of the effects, I think, that are obvious to you all probably, that, in terms of sexual harassment and the long-lasting effects on individuals, right? Potential dropout, lost opportunities, fear of coming to school, anxiety, depression. And then effects on teams, right? If you're an employee experiencing sexual harassment, you might not want to come to work very often. I certainly wouldn't. Neglect, decreased focus, loss of productivity. So all of these things are really reasons why this is so important to understand where our rights are and where we should be reporting to make sure that this conduct is addressed appropriately so that these things don't happen, right? Or that we can decrease the amount of times that these happen. And also the new rules, the new Title IX regulations really focus on fair, unbiased processes. I'll probably sound like a broken record today when I'm talking about that, but really their focus is on how unfair processes can really have long-lasting and detrimental effects. So the point of the new Title IX rules is really to ensure that there's a lot of process in order to make sure that individuals do have a fair process to address sexual harassment. And then, most importantly in my wheelhouse, responding to sexual harassment is required by law. So the Illinois Human Rights Act, We'll talk about a couple other laws. Title VII, Title IX, all prohibit sexual harassment or discrimination based on sex. And so it's really a requirement pursuant to Title IX and some of those other laws that we respond to Title IX sexual harassment or other sexual harassment in an appropriate manner. I'll just touch really quick on the Department of Education is really the entity that's responsible for enforcing Title IX. And the OCR for Title IX, the Office of Civil Rights, has offices all over the country. We have one in Chicago here, but that's really what we're focused on in terms of legality. We don't want a complaint to go to OCR that you then are spending a year, 2 years more responding to, complying with, doing upkeep and monitoring for. So that's really what we're trying to avoid here. Okay, so what's Title IX? I think a lot of times when people think of Title IX, they think about sports, especially if you've been in education for a long time. And I think that thought is exactly correct, right? That's how it started. But what we're really seeing is that here's the statute for Title IX, and it says no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity that receives federal financial assistance. So no mention of sports there, right? There's also no mention of sexual harassment, which we're going to talk about in a second. So what falls under Title IX? Everything on this slide, right? So things like, sex-based harassment, which is what we're going to be talking about primarily today, but athletics, your financial assistance to pregnant and parenting students, single-sex education, discipline, all of these things are going to fall under Title IX if there's discrimination on the basis of sex, okay? The Title IX regulations, like I was talking about earlier, the ones that came out in August of 2020, they really now focus primarily on sexual harassment. So while Title IX covers all of the things on the last slide that we just talked about, the Title IX regulations have a real focus on sexual harassment. And we're going to talk about what the definitions of those are and how we respond to sexual harassment. But the new regulations really establish pretty onerous procedures for school districts to follow with respect to a grievance procedure to address Title IX sexual harassment. There's a requirement that you designate a Title IX coordinator, and that person is named and easy to find. And then there's a lot of other requirements that we'll touch on a little bit today. Again, my main focus is really going to be how do we define Title IX sexual harassment, and not so much on the process, although we'll touch on that just so you have a flavor of what that might look like. Okay, so when does a school have to respond to Title IX sexual harassment? It really depends on which law you're looking at, right? So for employment, we have the Illinois Human Rights Act, Title VII and Title IX. For students, we have the Illinois Human Rights Act, some sex equity regulations, and Title IX as well. And all of these have different definitions of sexual harassment, so it gets a little bit hairy. We're not going to go over each of these today. I'm going to be focused on Title IX, but do know that, and this is probably my other broken record piece, do know that even though it doesn't fall under Title IX sexual harassment under the definitions we're going to talk about today, that doesn't mean that we don't then address that behavior, right? So we could be addressing that behavior under a different board policy. We could be addressing that behavior because of our responsibilities under the Illinois Human Rights Act, for example. So Title IX is going to use one process, and we'll talk about that, and then everything else kind of gets scooped up into, your board policies with respect to student codes of conduct or bullying or something like that. So when does a school have to respond to Title IX sexual harassment under the 2020 regulations? So the 2020 regulations require a school to respond to Title IX sexual harassment when it has actual knowledge of Title IX sexual harassment in an education program or activity against a person in the United States. Let's break that down a little bit. I know it's a little bit of a mouthful. So first, let's talk about actual knowledge. And this standard is a little bit different if you've worked in Title IX in the past or if you work on investigations of student misconduct or employee misconduct. So actual knowledge here under the Title IX rules means you're sensing it or someone has reported it to you, right? So sensing it, you're hearing it, you're seeing it, you've witnessed this conduct occur, or you're the recipient of this conduct, right? So either you're the recipient of sexual harassment or you see two students in the hallway engaging in sexual misconduct, or it's reported to you. So say a student comes up to you after class and says, Miss Tulloch, I feel like this student has been poking my butt in class all day or all week. That's a report to you that you now have actual knowledge of. What this takes away is the need to kind of dig, should have known, should I have known about something that wasn't actually reported? That's no longer the standard, right? So it's if it was reported to you or if you sensed it. And this is going to be to any official with authority. So officials with authority under the Title IX rules are your Title IX coordinator. And for K-12 schools like you all, it's everybody. So if anybody in your school at all senses or receives a report of Title IX sexual harassment or sexual misconduct, you should be reporting that conduct to your Title IX coordinator immediately. And how can you make these reports, right? So any person is able to make a report of sexual harassment. So that's regardless of whether you're the alleged victim, right? Say a student comes up to you and makes that report, you should be going to the Title IX coordinator. It's not the student's responsibility to then, make that report initially. That responsibility lies with you. So anybody can make a report. This is the same with, if you have a friend who's a coworker and they're explaining to you that another coworker is making them feel really uncomfortable, even in those situations, I think you should be reporting that conduct to the Title IX coordinator. And the Title IX coordinator and your Title IX team are then going to be able to determine what's the best resolution here. Do we use our Title IX process or do we use a different process, right? It's not going to be up to you to make that determination, but do know that if there's, any inkling of sexual impropriety, sexual misconduct, anything that sounds like sexual harassment, that's what we should be reporting. Excuse me, reports can be made by, mail, phone, email. You can walk into the Title IX coordinator's office. There's no requirement with respect to how a report is made. And reports can be made at any time. So you don't need to, email within business hours or anything like that. So there's no requirements with respect to format or anything like that. I will note that this means the key word here is really allegation. So when you as an individual, as an official with authority, have actual knowledge of sexual harassment that, if true, say we take all of the allegations as true, if it would constitute Title IX sexual harassment under the definition we're going to talk about soon, then the school has an obligation to respond. Again, that's going to be your Title IX coordinator's job, your Title IX team's job, but just know that we take the allegations as true to determine which process we use. So really quick, let's talk about, a quick issue spotting. So let's say you're a principal and you're served with an order of protection that requires one student to have no contact with another student in the same school due to alleged sexual assault. Here, I think obviously we're going to comply with the terms of the order. You're probably going to call us. But think about here whether we now have knowledge about Title IX sexual harassment. So when you get this no contact order, do you think that you're now on actual notice of potential Title IX sexual harassment? I'm seeing nodding yeses. Yeah, I completely agree with you all. This is a situation where if I saw this come across my desk as a principal, I would be going to the Title IX coordinator and saying, hey, we might have an issue here. Now we're going to talk about the definition of Title IX sexual harassment in a minute here. And there's a lot of reasons why this might not actually fall under our Title IX process, and we might address it under our student code of conduct or a different board policy. But again, this is something where we have actual notice of potential Title IX sexual harassment because of an alleged assault between two students that's affecting the school environment, right? So that's when your Title IX coordinator should absolutely be involved. So let's move on to the next portion of the definition for when a school has to respond. So Title IX sexual harassment. Let's talk about the definitions of Title IX sexual harassment. And again, you do not have to memorize these. There will not be a quiz, as far as I know. But just know that if you're seeing any types of this conduct, it should ring a light bulb in your head, like a light bulb should go off, and you should be reporting that conduct to your Title IX coordinator. And also use your supervisors. I mean, the requirement to report to your Title IX coordinator is under Title IX, so a report to a supervisor doesn't supersede your requirement to report to your Title IX coordinator. But I think your supervisors can be really helpful with respect to, you know, what are the next steps here? Who should I make this report to? How should I make this report if you're ever questioning? So again, our different laws have different definitions of Title IX sexual harassment. I'm going to focus on Title IX today. So we have three definitions of sexual harassment under Title IX. We've got quid pro quo, hostile environment, and then our VAWA Big Four, which is sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. And I'm going to go over each one of these. So first, what's quid pro quo? I think we've heard this phrase a lot recently, and it literally translates to something for something, right? So under Title IX, quid pro quo, Title IX sexual harassment is sexual harassment that an employee of the school, where an employee of the school conditions an aid, benefit, or service of a student's education on participation in some sort of unwelcome sexual conduct. So quid pro quo only applies to employees to students. There's no quid pro quo if it's employee to employee or student to student. But here, the Department of Education has really said, if an employee is conditioning benefits of the school upon unwelcome sexual conduct, we're automatically assuming that this is severe enough to go into Title IX territory. We don't have to do any other analysis. So I think a lot of times when we think about quid pro quo, it's, a teacher saying, if you give me sex, I'll give you an A on your test. I know a lot of times I get some chuckles at that because I think we all know that that's not right, and we all know that that shouldn't be done. But I've got to tell you, we see a lot of quid pro quo complaints still. So it is happening. And it might not be as overt as, sex for an A, but I do think that this is really still occurring and we have to be vigilant about it. So just do know that this would fall under your Title IX requirements. I'm going to skip over to our VAWA Clery Act Big Four definitions. So those are sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. These don't mean that the Clery Act and the Violence Against Women Act now apply to K-12 schools. They don't. These are typically, for higher education institutions. But what I will say is the definitions within these laws are now being used in Title IX. So if something falls under the definition of sexual assault as the Clery Act defines sexual assault, then it's going to be under our Title IX policies and procedures. So just know, again, these don't require any additional analysis. It's just, is it sexual assault? Is it stalking? Those are going to be Title IX. We're going to address those under our Title IX grievance procedure. So again, just if you hear of conduct that you think like, oh, that sounds, like it could be stalking. And even if you don't know this definition, again, if you're thinking it sounds wrong, unwelcome, sexually motivated, that's conduct that we should be reporting. Now we're going to talk about Title IX, hostile environment, sexual harassment for quite a bit, because I think this is really the trickiest one. And this is where a big change in the law occurred when the 2020 regulations were released. So Title IX, hostile environment, sexual harassment used to be, before the 2020 regulations, unwelcome conduct that was severe, pervasive, or persistent as to interfere with a student's ability to really participate or access educational services. Now, the definition that we're working with is unwelcome conduct that is so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive, that it denies equal access to your school's education program or activity. We're going to break this down a bit too, because I know there's a lot here. But really the main difference that I want to point out is we have a much higher bar now. So it has to be severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive, not just one of them when we had our or here before. So we have to kind of, the bar has been raised with respect to what's going to fall under Title IX. Again, and I'm going to say it 20 times, but even if something doesn't fall under this Title IX definition of sexual harassment, that doesn't mean we're not going to address it under a different policy. Okay, so let's break down the definition just a little bit. So first we have unwelcome conduct, right? So the conduct has to be unwelcome. So here is where age matters, culture matters, the ability of the individual matters, or potential disability status with respect to whether the conduct was welcomed. This is why we don't go through this analysis of hostile environment when it's quid pro quo, for example, because we've already assumed that it's meeting all these categories. It's unwelcome because it's an adult and a student, and there's a power dynamic and all of these things, right? So we don't have to go through all of this. They participated, that doesn't necessarily mean it's welcome, right? A student might have gone along with sexual joking because they didn't want to, feel peer pressured, or they didn't want to feel ostracized, or they wanted the, bullying or the conduct to stop sooner, right? An individual might submit to a sexual assault so that it's done faster, or that, maybe they didn't have the ability to respond appropriately or in a different manner. So just base participation in the conduct does not necessarily make it welcome. Same with silence, right? Just because a student didn't say no, or just because it wasn't, reported sooner, doesn't mean that the conduct was welcome either. So just think about unwelcomeness with respect to, whether the student or the employee really felt as though this was not conduct they wanted to engage in. We're also going to be looking at severe, whether the conduct was severe. So that's something more than juvenile behavior, right? It's more than jokes. It's more than, kids messing around and making silly comments. It really has to be more than just that, kind of crass or rude conduct. So simple acts of, teasing or name calling won't necessarily be enough, even if the comments are based on sex. It's also, so it's not enough essentially to show that a student has been teased or just called offensive names. There really has to be something above that. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So if it doesn't rise above that level, that level remains kind of pervasive or consistent.
Sure.
At that point, does it eventually meet the threshold?
So for Title IX sexual harassment purposes specifically, it needs to rise to that level. It also needs to be pervasive, and it also needs to be objectively offensive. So it needs to have all three of those. If in a situation like you're talking about, say it's really pervasive conduct, they're calling the individual kind of a teasy name, but it's every day, right? Like that's the person's new nickname. But it's not severe. We're going to address that under maybe our bullying policy, or maybe a student code of conduct policy. We're not going to address it under our Title IX policy, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but it's 265 was your Title IX grievance procedure. We're just not going to go through that whole process. We're going to do, something different that might apply. Yeah, please feel free to ask questions. It's, we're here in person, so that's kind of the benefit. The next requirement under our Title IX hostile environment definition is pervasive. So that means it has to be systemic or widespread. This means it has to be multiple incidents. The Department of Education has really come out and said one instance is not going to be enough, even if it's really severe, which again is a little bit of a change. Before the 2020 regulations, it could have been pushed into this category, but now the Department of Ed has really said no. If it's one instance, it's not severe or not pervasive. What I will note, though, is say a sexual assault is alleged. Sexual assault, very severe, right? Now we have that definition under the Cleary-Vawa Act that already pushes this into Title IX. So we're not having to do this analysis for something that's that severe. So just keep that in mind. And then objectively offensive is the last kind of hurdle we have to get over. So that's behavior that would be offensive to a reasonable person in similar circumstances. So that means that we have to consider what would not just be offensive to the victim or the alleged victim themselves, but what a reasonable person might find offensive. And you're going to consider a lot of things when you're making this determination. So you're going to consider, the age of the individuals involved, the relationships of the individuals involved, kind of really the constellation of expectations and circumstances that are around the conduct itself to identify whether it meets this objectively offensive hurdle. So here's some of the things that you'll consider with respect to hostile environment. So again, context, nature, scope, frequency, relationships, identities, ages of the individuals involved. I think conduct of first graders is going to be, the same conduct by first graders is going to be looked at a lot differently if the same conduct occurs in middle school or in high school, right? And then in terms of our definition for when a school has to respond to Title IX sexual harassment, access to the school's educational programs or activity have to be, limited or denied as a result of the conduct of the sexual misconduct. So let's just take a couple hypos here. We can do these really quickly, but kind of thumbs up, thumbs down, or middle if I need more information or I don't know. Is this Title IX sexual harassment? So our first one is a teacher makes a sexually inappropriate comment to a student in class. Title IX sexual harassment, not, I don't know, I need more information. What do you guys think? Is it Title IX sexual harassment? Yes. I see some thumbs up. I see a lot of thumbs down. I see a lot of sideways. Okay. I agree. I agree with the indecision here a little bit. I think I would probably land on, based on the information we have here, no, but we need more information also probably, right? So if a teacher is making a sexually inappropriate comment to a student one time, that's not going to be Title IX sexual harassment, right? Because it's not pervasive. It's only happened one time. But let's think about, what if the teacher is making this sexually inappropriate comment once a week, once a month? Are we now moving into that pervasive category? And then the other question is, what is the sexually inappropriate comment, right? Is it objectively offensive? Is it severe? Probably, because it's a teacher to a student here, but this isn't quid pro quo, right? It's not conditioning an aid or a benefit on something. We would have to be analyzing this under hostile environment. So based on the information we have here, I would say no, because it's only happened one time. If it happens more than one time, then I think we're probably in a Title IX category. Yeah.
So I have a different question.
Sure.
But I don't know if it relates to that. So, could the action of making this sexually inappropriate joke to a student, even if it's one time, set a stage for grooming or something else, and therefore, immediately set itself to a level of severity that we can action on? It doesn't seem like that's an appropriate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, so we're going to talk about, once we get through these definitions, we're going to talk about which policy you follow. But you're absolutely correct. Not appropriate behavior, right? This should absolutely be addressed. It's just going to be addressed under your employee code of conduct, different board policy, 5120. It's going to be just under something that's not Title IX. We're going to get to why that's so important. But the reason is your Title IX procedures are just, they have so many steps. There's so much to do. If you can not respond to conduct under your Title IX procedures because it's not Title IX, it falls under something else, I think I see most of our clients and most of our schools saying, yeah, I'd really rather do that because this process is just, it's long, it's tiring, there's a lot of requirements. Okay, let's talk about the second example here. So what about a teacher tells a student to trade a back rub in the classroom for a good grade on a test? Sexual harassment, Title IX? No? All thumbs up? Great. Quid pro quo, I think that one's pretty clear. But again, this is quid pro quo, so we don't have to think about, is it severe, is it pervasive, is it objectively offensive? We're already in that category. We go straight to our Title IX procedures. What about a student sends a photo of their privates to their significant other who is another student from the school bathroom? Yes, Title IX sexual harassment? No, or I'm unsure, I need more information. Seeing a lot of no's and some I need information. I agree with you all here. I wouldn't put this into Title IX sexual harassment quite yet, right? So this is one time, so it's probably not pervasive yet. We have to also think about, was this unwelcome? Did the other student potentially ask for this photo? You know, did they have a habit of exchanging these photos and enjoyed them? You know, so it might not be unwelcome to meet our standard. And it's certainly not pervasive because it only happened once. What about if the recipient of the nude photo from this previous example texts the photo to the group chat of 20 other classmates? Is that now Title IX sexual harassment? Yes? No? Still unsure? All right, I'm seeing responses all over the board here. A lot of needs more information. Here I would say this to me is Title IX sexual harassment because it's now pervasive. 20 people have received this photo. Even if they sent it one time. Yeah, that's a great clarification. Yeah. That's a great clarification. So the act occurred one time, right? But it's pervasive now because 20 people have now received it. So we function as though this is ongoing, or say they post the photo online on Facebook or something. That we're thinking is now an ongoing offense because people are viewing it repeatedly.
So when we're thinking about pervasive under the umbrella of Title IX,
Mm-hmm.
it's not only repeatedly,
Right.
but it's also like
Widespread. Yep. Yeah, we can think about it both ways. And a lot of times the more widespread conduct comes into play when we're talking about communications or social media, you know, online, those kinds of things is where we're going to see that more often. Because again, like now that this photo is out there or that it's been posted or something, we're considering that as like people are accessing this kind of constantly. So now it's pervasive. I'd also call it severe. You know, I'm going to assume, I agree maybe with some of you who were saying, you know, I'm not sure, we need more information. I'm going to assume that this student probably didn't want their nude photo shared with 20 people. I'm going to assume it's unwelcome. That to me is, you know, sharing sexual private parts. That's severe. It's objectively offensive. I think any of us would find it offensive if a nude photo was shared with, you know, 20 of our classmates. So here I would say yes. Again, any of these happen, you have information about any of these, a student reports any of these to you, you see any of this happen, these should all be just reported to your Title IX coordinator so that they can make the determination of, is it Title IX sexual harassment, or as your question pointed out earlier, is it something different that's not Title IX but that we still absolutely need to address? Any questions on these? Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see what you're saying. So what we're looking at is not necessarily the effect on how many people, it's whether the conduct itself was pervasive. So the conduct, the teacher wasn't, in the first example here, the conduct the teacher isn't making the comment to multiple students. Say like students are walking into class, the teacher, says, showing a lot of leg there. You're wearing kid's wearing a mini skirt. That we're going to say is not pervasive in the sense of Title IX sexual harassment. Does that not mean that we're going to call, that doesn't mean that we're not going to call that teacher into the office and say, this was wildly inappropriate, or go through some sort of disciplinary proceeding. That's not Title IX. But the reason that they're different is the conduct itself in the first example was only iterated once, versus the conduct in the fourth example, that individual, the conduct itself was the sending of the photos, versus the conduct being the comment, not necessarily the audience or reaction. Does that make sense? Sure.
I'm not sure if this applies, but I'm just wondering, what is the reasoning for the differences? Like, it seems like there's sexual harassment or harassment, hostile environment, but then there's Title IX. Why is there a difference other than, are there increased consequences?
That's a good question. So we've got our two houses, right? So we've got Title IX, which has our hostile environment, our quid pro quo, and our Clery VAWA Act Big Four, right? And then we have sexual harassment that's not Title IX, that say might be defined by your board policies or might be defined by the Illinois Human Rights Act, that might be a little bit different. Why do we have these two different definitions? Great question. But the difference is really going to be with respect to how we respond. I wasn't legislating these, so I'm not exactly sure what their reasoning was, but the reason why we're going over this today and why this is important is really because if it falls under one of these Title IX categories, your hostile environment, your quid pro quo, your VAWA Clery Act Big Four, those are going to be handled under your Title IX grievance procedure, which is Board Policy 2265. And the procedures, which we're going to talk about a little bit more today, are really onerous. So we have to have a notice to our alleged victim. We have to offer them support services. We have to go through an investigation. We have to write an investigation report. We have to swap evidence. We have to do cross-examination questions. We have to have a decision. They have appeal rights. All of that is under Title IX, and the law really says if it is Title IX sexual harassment, we have to go through those procedures, and they're really, frankly, they're burdensome for schools, I think. If it's sexual harassment that's not Title IX, then we follow a completely different policy. We follow our typical investigation procedures that don't involve 10 notices and a written determination, an investigation report, and cross-examination questions. We don't have to go through all of that. So I think that's the biggest difference here. And again, if you're not on your district's Title IX team, you're not going to have to be doing these determinations. I just think it's important for you all to know kind of where this road kind of diverges, both if you're a part of an investigation or if you're reporting Title IX sexual harassment, or with respect to the definitions, just to make sure that if any of this conduct you're seeing really needs to be reported up to your Title IX coordinator. That's really the difference, is what procedure we use.
If I could add one piece of it, the reason there's also two different laws is that the Title IX part of it does not apply to private sector employers, for instance, where the Title VII, under what sexual harassment otherwise is, does apply to private sector employers. Because you are a public sector employer, both of them apply here. We have students also, so Title IX also comes into play. So we still have to apply them both, but they function in two different worlds sometimes.
Yeah, thank you, Shelley.
And I think Title IX also applies to other groups of people, not just to sexual harassment. Like it protects other people too.
Title VII does that. So Title VII is also race and other protected characteristics. Title IX is specific to just sexual discrimination.
So, but meaning like pregnancies in school and...
Right. That Title IX covers that because those are sex-based. Yeah. But yeah, so it covers a lot of categories of people with respect to, or categories of conduct, but they all have to be sex-based. Yep. All right. You good before we move on? Okay. So we're going to touch briefly on the remainder of our definition here. So The conduct also has to occur in your school's education program or activity. What does that mean? That means any location, events, or circumstance over which the school exhibits substantial control over the alleged harasser and the context in which the harassment occurred. So I think the big question here is often what happens with online conduct, and especially now, what happens if this conduct is occurring, in someone's TikTok DMs or, over text message or, another app. This is a big question here. I think it's a lot easier when the students are on campus texting. That's a lot easier. We have control over the context, right? They're in school. Or if they're using your school's Wi-Fi to send the messages, or if they're using a district device to send the harassing messages or engage in the harassing conduct. It's a lot easier when we have some of those facts. What happens if students are out of school, not during school hours, on personal devices? We don't really have control over the students or the context in that situation. So that conduct, if it's completely personal devices, completely off school grounds, not using our Wi-Fi, that's not going to probably fall under our Title IX response requirements. Again, though, if that conduct is affecting the school, if students are coming in and feeling really uncomfortable, we should be addressing those under a different policy then. And then finally, it's against a person in the United States. I think this ends up affecting higher education institutions a little bit more. But that means that if one of your classes takes a spring break trip abroad, or something like that, and there's an alleged sexual assault that occurs while they're in Costa Rica, that's not going to fall under Title IX sexual harassment because it didn't occur in the United States. We're absolutely going to address that conduct elsewhere, but this is just one of those limiting factors under a Title IX. Why is this so important? Why do we need to know all of these factors for when a school has to respond versus when you don't have to respond under Title IX? The reason is, in the 2020 regulations, there are mandatory reasons for dismissal. So that means, say I'm a complainant and I make a complaint of alleged sexual misconduct to you as the Title IX coordinator. And it happened in Costa Rica on a spring break trip that was, through my Spanish class. The Title IX regulations are going to require you to dismiss that under Title IX, and then you handle it under a different policy, right? So that's because it doesn't meet our definition of Title IX sexual harassment. It didn't occur in the United States. It occurred in our program or activity. It was sexual assault, so it falls under the sexual harassment definition, but it didn't meet that other standard of occurring in the United States. So the reason this is so important is because there's mandatory dismissal requirements. Again, your Title IX coordinator is going to be responsible for these, but do know that that's kind of why we're going over all of these today. There's also permissive bases for dismissal, and those are if the complainant requests to withdraw their complaint in writing, if the respondent's enrollment or employment ends. So say the student graduates, the student who's purported to or alleged to have committed the conduct graduates. Do you have to continue your Title IX investigation? You don't have to. You can dismiss, or you can, certainly continue that investigation. It's up to your district Title IX team. And then specific circumstances prevent the school from gathering evidence. So say the complainant is unknown or the complainant doesn't want to cooperate, and you really have no ability to gather any evidence, that's when you might also dismiss under Title IX. So we've talked about when a school has to respond. Let's talk about what the response looks like. Again, this is really going to be for your Title IX team to go over, but I think it's important for you to have a landscape of what the response looks like under your Title IX grievance procedure. So we've talked about this a lot today. So you have your Title IX sexual harassment grievance procedure and any related administrative procedures. So for you all, that's Board Policy 2265. If it's Title IX sexual harassment, we're using that policy to address it. And that comes with all of the requirements that we listed earlier, right? Our investigation, our written determination, our sharing evidence. That's all under your Title IX sexual harassment grievance procedure. If it is not Title IX sexual harassment, but maybe it is sexual misconduct still, or maybe it's bullying, or maybe it's, something else, we're going to address it under one of our other policies. We don't just let that conduct go, right? So you have your policy 2260, which is your uniform grievance procedure that can address that you can address that conduct under, or other rules or policies that might not be related to sexual harassment, so bullying or something of that nature. What can't be done is what in criminal law is often called double jeopardy. So if you watch, SVU or any of those, that really means that an individual can't be tried twice for the same crime, okay? That's the same with Title IX. So let's say our Title IX coordinator determines that the conduct as alleged, and if we consider it to be true, would constitute Title IX sexual harassment. And we open a Title IX, the complainant signs a Title IX complaint, we start our Title IX investigation, right? We go through the entire investigation, and at the end, the written determination says, no sexual harassment occurred, there was no conduct violation or no policy violation, we don't find that this occurred, okay? We can't then go back under our 226 or 2260 or a bullying or a student code of conduct and say, well, let's see if they'd be guilty under an easier policy to prove. We can't do that, right? We've already made a determination, we can't go back. When we can do this is if you've dismissed under Title IX, if you've determined it's not Title IX sexual harassment, we can then go over and use a different policy. But we can't go through the whole Title IX process, say, no, you didn't do it. Let's see if we can get you under something else. So here's really what we've been talking about all day today, right? So if it's Title IX sexual harassment, if it's in a school program or activity, if it's in the United States, we need to check all those boxes. If that's true, and if the allegations, if true, would constitute Title IX sexual harassment under one of our definitions, we're using our sexual harassment grievance procedure immediately. Anything else, we're using a different policy or procedure. I'm going to quickly go through what an adequate response looks like. So an adequate response by the school has 5 components. So we have the initial response and supportive measures, we have informal resolution, the investigation, the decision, and then there's appeal rights as well. So the initial response and supportive measures is our first requirement for an adequate response. So this is really going to come down to your Title IX coordinator. Your Title IX coordinator has to be called the Title IX coordinator in their name, in their title. They have to meet with the alleged victim, who's our complainant, of sexual harassment once they have knowledge. So that means you make a report to the Title IX coordinator that, there was a report of sexual assault between 2 students. I'm reporting this to you. The Title IX coordinator is then going to call in that alleged victim and say, hey, I heard about this. Here's what's going on. Here's how you can file a formal complaint under our policies to start this Title IX process. And here's our policy on Title IX sexual harassment. And also, let's talk about any supportive measures that we might put in place while this investigation is ongoing. Supportive measures can be offered whether a complainant decides to sign a formal complaint and start that Title IX process or not. And also, once the Title IX process is started, supportive measures can also be offered to the respondent as well. So things that are non-punitive, non-disciplinary in nature. So think, tutoring, if a student has kind of fallen behind in some classes, counseling, or those types of services, potentially leaving class a little bit early so they don't have to be in passing periods with the respondent, having an aide, walk with the student in the hallways. So things like that. And you might be responsible for helping implement some of these as well, even if you're not on your Title IX team. So just understand that those opportunities are kind of throughout the Title IX process, but also even before a complaint is filed. So this is what we just talked about here. This is what you're going to talk about in the initial response. And then our supportive measures, again, are really non-punitive, individualized services. So they're offered throughout the Title IX process. They're offered, I think a lot of times it's just helpful to talk to the complainant and say, hey, what would help you? So it can be offered at any point, and it's really to restore or preserve equal access to the education program or activity without burdening the other party. So that means, for example, a supportive measure at this stage cannot be removing the respondent from the class because the complainant doesn't want the respondent in their class anymore. That would be punitive to the respondent. So think of, supportive measures instead of maybe we can rearrange our seating arrangements in class. Maybe the respondent also wants to move classes. Great, right? But I think we have to think here of making sure that these aren't going to be punitive to one of the parties, because they can't be punitive, the Department of Ed says, until we've gone through that whole Title IX process and made a determination of responsibility. So, if the respondent wasn't responsible for this behavior, we can't be punishing them before we've made that determination. And any supportive measures should be kept confidential. So what's our second step for an adequate response? It's going to be informal resolution, and this process is voluntary. I think this looks a lot like, restorative practice or, a peace circle, those types of conversations. It is not required, but the parties can both say, hey, I want to engage in this process. I think this would be a really great way to come to a resolution. And if they do, and if they both agree, great. Like, let's go ahead and use that resource. I will say informal resolution cannot be used if it's quid pro quo. So that's the only time that it's not allowed, because really think of that power imbalance there, right? If a student and an employee are sitting in a room with a facilitator, a student really might not feel comfortable, having that conversation or coming to a resolution that's not coerced. The informal resolution process is available anytime between a formal complaint of Title IX sexual harassment being filed and the decision. So anytime before a decision is made, this can be entered. And anytime once the parties have entered informal resolution, at any time they can say, I thought this was going to be a good idea. It wasn't. I don't want to do this anymore. That's fine. We hop right back into our Title IX process then. Investigation is the third stage. This is kind of the bulk of where the requirements with respect to your Title IX grievance procedure are going to come into play. Investigations now under the 2020 rules require a lot of specific steps for investigations. It's really a major shift from I think what we're used to when we're doing employee or student misconduct investigations, and it's a huge shift if you've been working in Title IX before the 2020 regulations. It really prescribes very specific procedures that we have to follow, and those are all laid out in your Title IX grievance procedure, so you do have them in front of you. But it's just a lot. It's a lot to keep up with, and it takes a lot of time and effort. So what are those contents of the investigation? I'm not going to go through all of these in depth with you guys. I don't want to bog you down with all of the procedures. Know that there's just a lot of requirements here. So the burden of proof is really on the school to do an appropriate investigation. There has to be an opportunity for witnesses and parties to exchange evidence, for parties to, support their position. There's going to be opportunities for evidence swapping, and that all culminates in an investigative report. That investigative report then gets sent to your Title IX decision maker, who essentially makes a determination with respect to whether there is Title IX sexual harassment based on the information gathered during the investigation. There are no hearings required at the K-12 level. They are permitted. I will say I don't think I know of any K-12 school that is doing live hearings. If I didn't have to, I wouldn't either. So do know that it's permitted, not required. Your district does not do live hearings for K-12 students. Written determination, that's going to be where we say, is there Title IX sexual harassment, yes or no? It's going to include, the allegations, all of the steps we took in our investigation, all of the relevant evidence, and then explanations as for whether each allegation occurred or did not occur. At this point, once we've made a written determination, we can include remedies now. So that means we can include any punitive or disciplinary measures. Say our written determination says, yes, the respondent did engage in Title IX sexual harassment. At that point, we can move forward with removing that individual from the class, or suspensions or further discipline from there. Remedies can also be supportive in nature. We can also say, hey, there's going to be some sort of disciplinary action, but we also think you would benefit from additional counseling services, or additional X, Y, or Z, some sort of other support that's not punitive. Those can absolutely be included here. And in addition, remedies can also address individuals or the larger community. So a remedy might be looking back at our policies or procedures, or looking back at how we assign, field trip bus seats if that's where something happened, or looking back at how, maybe doing a school-wide or a class-wide presentation on sexual harassment. Things like that can also be remedies under Title IX. And finally, appeal. So under the new Title IX rules, there are appeal rights. So both parties have an opportunity to appeal any determination that's made under the Title IX investigation process. And there's only 3 bases for appeal. So either there was a procedural issue that would have affected the outcome, that new evidence that wasn't available at the time of the investigation was found and would have affected the outcome, or that there was bias or conflict of interest throughout the process that, again, would have affected the outcome. So we can't just say, I didn't like this determination, I want to go back and do it again. It has to be under one of these narrow appeal bases. Finally, I'm going to just round out by talking about bias, conflicts of interest, and other fairness concerns. I mentioned early on in the presentation that the new rules have a real focus on ensuring that members of our Title IX team are not biased, don't have conflicts of interest, and don't prejudge any of the allegations. This is really important to the Trump administration, Department of Education, when these rules came out, because they really wanted to ensure that both complainants and respondents had a fair shake. So that means that your Title IX coordinator, investigator, decision makers, informal resolution facilitators, all those members of your Title IX team cannot have conflicts of interest or bias for or against complainants or respondents individually or generally. They also can't prejudge any matters before them. So just, again, making sure that we're coming at these equally. I think as educators, there's so much emphasis on equity. This is not where equity comes into play. This is straight equality. So that's really what the regulations are looking for when we're going through our Title IX process. I know I talked really fast, and that was a ton of information. Any questions? No more? Well, thank you guys so much. Really, the main thing here, again, report, report, report if you have any inkling of sexual impropriety, sexual misconduct at all, report it to your Title IX coordinator. It's really going to just help your district respond in the most appropriate manner. Thank you.
5-minute break, yeah. Okay, are we ready to get started? And Luke, I need to use this for the people who are streaming, right? All right. Small room to use this for, so. All right, I am going to be talking first about investigations and responding to employee misconduct. If you have questions as we go, please feel free to ask me. It's going to overlap a little bit with the second part of the presentation, but we're doing a little separately, but the secondary part, which is evaluation. So we're going to you'll see where they overlap, but importantly, in terms of the discipline and performance, wanting to address them a little separately as it relates to investigation. So I know that many of you are likely involved in this at different levels in terms of the investigations of when an employment issue comes up and how an investigation might be triggered. So just to review the ways that it can come in, obviously, the first most obvious one is the observation of the misconduct. You actually see something in your building that causes you to want to investigate or feel like you need to investigate. There's a complaint that comes in, whether it's from a student or from another colleague, a staff member comes in related to conduct that needs to be investigated. Or perhaps a parent calls and alleges that something happened in the classroom that you need to investigate. The next two, rumors and anonymous tips, it's too awkward to hold up here. Rumors and anonymous tips are also pieces that we have to investigate. And I often get the question of, if something's anonymous, why do we have to investigate it? And what do we do in terms of if someone says on the tip line or comes in and drops off, not so much frequently, but a note that says, teacher A did something. Why do we have to investigate that? And obviously, life has changed in terms of what we have access to and availability to and our responsibilities in terms of harassment or conduct between teachers and other staff members or teachers and students. So when a rumor comes up, if it's something that you feel like has enough teeth to it, it is important that we at least initially look into it. That does not necessarily trigger the level of investigation that we've done if an actual complaint that was signed in writing came into you, but it's not to say that we can just ignore anything that comes in or ignore something that you hear about going on. Now, the best example I can give you is the most egregious example, whereas if there's rumors going around the school about a teacher acting inappropriately with a student, you cannot ignore that, even if it's just a rumor. And that is something that we have to at least initially look into to try to nail down that we have done a cursory investigation, that it in fact is just a rumor, and there's nothing else that needs to be done further than that. Relatedly, an anonymous tip that comes in, if that is something that could rise to the level of concern about a staff member's conduct, or certainly could put the district at potential liability, it's something that we have to look into. And how do you look into something, an anonymous tip? It only requires you to do as much as you can from the information you have. So if an anonymous tip comes in and it identifies there is an English teacher at York who is hitting kids in the classroom. Well, there aren't that many English teachers at York, so we try to look into it the best we can in terms of what's going on in those classrooms. If it's just a teacher in the district is hitting kids in the classroom, you're far too big, likely, to be doing anything else other than that. So perhaps it's letting whomever received it, letting Luke know, and Luke can then talk to all the other principals. Is there any other complaints going on in your buildings? And think of Luke as kind of a central repository of information, because you all have your own buildings to run, but he might have information the rest of you do not have. So making sure that you at least alert him to that so that he's able to move forward with whatever information we have. So investigations. So we think of them in two different categories, and this is what I meant about the two pieces overlapping. There's monitoring teachers both in terms of conduct and performance. So conduct, think about things that are kind of occurring in the classroom that are not necessarily instructional in nature. And certainly our evaluation model has domain 4, talks a lot about professionalism, and there can be overlap there. But when we're talking about kind of misconduct, it's investigating and responding to a kind of immediate dismissal or dismissal based on something that's actually happening, so a conduct piece that's occurring, versus an instructional piece, which is performance. That we go through the teacher evaluation plan. And again, like I said, they can overlap, but we do think of them separately in terms of how we handle them. Performance under the evaluation model typically does not require an investigation. That's something that we're seeing happening in the classroom, where the conduct piece often requires us to do the investigation, even if we're ultimately going to include it in the evaluation domain 4 as well. Again, this just kind of reiterates what I just discussed with respect to conduct dismissal versus performance dismissal. And the reason this is significant is that if we're going forward with respect to a misconduct dismissal, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this at the end, because I think it's important that all of you as administrators understand the processes for both, is that you're really just talking about the conduct at issue that led to the decision to dismiss a teacher, where if it's a performance-based dismissal, the hearing officer ultimately who's going to review the case is going to look at all of those teachers' prior evaluations. It used to be under the misconduct piece that the hearing officer also took into account, well, you hit the kid, but how were you doing instructionally for the last 10 years also? That changed in 2012, where they now say, we don't necessarily care how you've been doing in the classroom for the last 12 years because you hit the kid in 2021. So that's a change in terms of how we process these cases. Here's our silly hypothetical that my partner Dana wrote, because this is what she does better than anybody else. Certainly, I'm sure nothing any of you have heard as principals about a parent coming in and complaining about one of your teachers not being kind to one of their angelic children. So the first thing we want to do is define the nature and scope of the investigation. Now, obviously, in this scenario, the conduct is not alleged to have been criminal. But the first thing, obviously, if someone comes in and reports something, the first thing that you should think about is the alleged conduct also criminal in nature? I want to give a general overlay that it is going to take some judgment on your part as to when you let HR know that there's something going on versus what you think you can handle in your building. And maybe that there's something, a secondary part of this that we can have a more specific conversation. I can talk to Luke and the superintendent about kind of what the expectations are there. But so we're just relying on your professional judgment there as to when Luke should be involved. If there's ever a question, please call him. Please call and say, this has happened. How much involvement does HR have versus how much can I handle at the building level? Obviously, if it's something alleged to have been criminal, we want Luke to know right away before you do anything else. Who are the necessary parties? So who is it that needs to be involved based on the conduct that's alleged? And here, obviously, Larry, the loudmouth, needs to be involved. We likely have to talk to the student. Depending upon what the student tells us happened, there might be a need to interview other students in the investigation as well. But we really want to look at who else is involved. If it's an employee coming in to complain about conduct by another employee, there might be other witnesses involved who you also need to investigate. And we're going to interview. And we'll talk about what that looks like during the investigation process as well. Policies and procedures. Regarding investigations that come into play. There isn't anything formally that you have. Some collective bargaining agreements really speak directly to what policies and procedures have to be followed when you're doing an investigation. Yours is not, fortunately, that prescriptive as to how you handle it, but you want to make sure that you were looking at that. You'd also, for instance, what Emily just talked about, if it was something that came in alleging Title IX, that you were aware of, this is the process and the policy I need to follow if it's something that could implicate Title IX. Most of the investigations that we do are under the uniform grievance procedure in terms of if a complaint comes in that way, not under the Title IX procedure. And while it does have certain benchmarks that need to be met and processes, it's not the same and as prescriptive as Title IX, and certainly not as onerous to follow. So just making yourself aware of what those are. For those of you who haven't read it, please go read Uniform Grievance Policy just so you understand kind of what that looks like and what's involved in that. Does the employee have a constitutionally protected property interest in their employment? That's really talking about most of your teachers and support staff do. So kind of at your level in terms of what you're investigating, virtually all of them do have some sort of property interest. Obviously, teachers more so than support staff in terms of the tenure laws. But what this is really talking about is there are some employees in the district who are at-will employees, and the processes that we need to follow necessarily are a bit different, but that doesn't really involve all of you at the building level as much as it does at the district level. And then, is a third-party independent investigator necessary? This, of course, is not a decision that you will be making. This would be a decision that the central office would be making, but just something for you to be aware of, that this does happen sometimes, that depending upon what the allegation is, sometimes the district will bring in a third-party investigator. That will either be someone entirely independent or someone from my office who will come in and do the investigation on behalf of the board. So, for instance, if it's an allegation against a high-level administrator, they will hire in someone to do the investigation. If it's an allegation of widespread hazing, are a number of investigations that I've done for districts, they bring in someone else to have an independent eye look at what's been going on in the district. So those are some examples that we use independent investigators for. So the next step is gathering the background information. Making sure that you review the personnel file and understand if there's anything else in there. So is there anything else in the personnel file related to Larry's interactions with students in the past? For those of you who have your private personnel files in your offices that I'm going to pretend like I do not know about because you're not supposed to have them, making sure that you are aware of what's in them as well as what's in the central office file. So making sure you look at both of those things. If it's someone who has, been in the district for a while, but perhaps you have not been in the district for a while, has there someone else who's also evaluated that person or might be aware of conduct that might not be recorded in the personnel file, although we would hope it would be. But is there anybody else you can talk to get a sense about kind of Larry and what his background is? What's the word on the street? I mean, there are teachers you know about, right, that you've heard stories about. Is this somebody who has a clean record, or is this somebody that you had concerns about, or if concerns have been shared with you in the past, just generally about the teacher's conduct? So you want to make sure you kind of just give some thought to that. And in terms of your CBA, as I mentioned before, what does it say about investigations and discipline? And certainly if you ever got to the level of discipline, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, that's something we would want to make sure that we involve HR with for the most part and make sure we're following our policies and what's in the three separate agreements that you have. So who should investigate? That's the next thing that we should think about. So if a complaint comes in to the assistant principal or to the principal, who should do the investigation? And there is not one right answer to this. It really depends on a number of factors, including kind of the type of complaint that's coming in. So is it something that's alleged to have happened like in a classroom, the teacher's interaction with a kid? Is it between two staff members? Is it a complaint of discrimination that's come in? So we want to look at all those factors to make a determination of who is going to do the investigation. Obviously, who else is involved? So how widespread is this? Is this something that we definitely need the central office to weigh in on and have them conduct the investigation, or is it really something that can be handled at the building level? Gender issues are important, especially if we have kids that are involved, depending upon who does the investigation. If we've got a female student who comes in and reports being made to feel uncomfortable by a teacher, whether it's male or female teacher, that student might have more level of comfort if there's a female administrator doing the investigation versus a male administrator. And that's not always the case, but certainly we want to just keep it top of mind. What can we do to make sure that there are not any hiccups or the least hiccups possible during the course of the investigation? And then history. There have been, too many occasions where I see a complaint come in about a teacher and the building administrator is the one who conducts the investigation. And the report that I get back from the union is, well, this administrator has always had it out for this teacher. You should have seen when they were teachers together, they had this big fight that happened and there's a personality conflict. So just being mindful of what is the history of the people involved, and is there anything that's going to get in the way of us conducting the best investigation we can. So obviously next we do is planning. Really important that you kind of give some big picture oversight to what you're going to do before you kind of jumping in with both feet. It'll definitely help you along the way. And the first piece of it is setting the scope, but being flexible. You definitely do not want to be so married to an idea that you can't, interview other people or change the course of how you're doing things, but just generally kind of getting assessment of the scope of who do you think you're going to need to interview in this process? What's the order of people that you're going to need to interview, and what different logistics would you have to make sure would be in place for that? Like I said, should the HR be notified? Should the ETC or PAS be notified? Depending upon what the allegations are. With respect to that piece of it, I do have to say that in most instances, we do let the union know when we are investigating something, because obviously they are a source of support both for the teacher, but can also help our investigation run smoothly. The one time that we are mindful of this, however, is if there's a student involved. Sometimes we need to have an investigation run, at least start the investigation before we necessarily let either the teacher or the union know that an investigation is being done. And Max yells about this every time I talk to him about it, but it's just the matter of fact of how we do things is that if a teacher has alleged to have done something to the kid, that teacher finding out about it before we get all the information can really negatively impact the investigation. So when we're looking at our relationship with the union versus the best interest of the student involved, we always pick the best interest of the student, and we can, Max is understanding, and we can usually sort that out with him. So just making sure that you're being mindful of that. We don't tell anyone anything that's going to impede our investigation moving forward. Other sources of information, so again, the personnel file, are there any audio or video recording of where the allegations alleged to have occurred, making sure you've seen all that before you take the next step in so that you know what information that you have at your fingertips already before you start the interviews. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question for those of you who are watching was, how do you handle the investigation if it's a rumor and you don't necessarily know if it's true, and then you impact the employee by starting the investigation? I think it would depend on what the nature of the rumor was. So for instance, if it's a rumor about a inappropriate conduct between a teacher and a student, for instance, I'm going to use that kind of the most egregious part of the investigation you could do. You know, I'm not that worried about upsetting the teacher. Like, you have to at least ask. Try to get to the bottom of where this rumor is coming from. Sometimes it's a matter of, you know, so many times it's the teacher has had the student over to do babysitting at their house. Other kids hear about this, and suddenly it's, do you know that Shelley is going over to Mr. Pavone's house every Saturday night? And it goes on from there. And a little bit of research would have shown that I'm actually babysitting his 2 wonderful children. I'm not actually doing there anything, and nothing nefarious is happening there. It takes a lot of professional judgment, but because we are in a kind of school building where culture is so important with respect to our staff, the safety of our students is of the utmost importance, you really do need to look into those. Now, how widespread the rumor is and what the nature of the conduct is will dictate how much of an investigation you actually need to do into it, but it's not appropriate to ever say, well, because it's just a rumor, there's nothing I'm going to do about it. Unfortunately, that's just if something were to ultimately happen thereafter, that would come back to impose liability likely on the district and potentially hurt a staff member or a student. So we want to be mindful of that. But I don't disagree with you. It's a tough situation to be in when you're hearing rumors, especially for those of you who know kids, there's lots of rumors that go around. So just being mindful of that. And the nature of the student, the student themselves is also part of that. So if you have a student coming in who's telling you something happened and the student has a propensity for exaggeration or propensity for not being truthful, the credibility issue, that might affect how you go about looking into this as well. And I'll see, one of the things we'll talk about in the investigations is that for those of you who are conducting them, you have to make credibility determinations. It's a hard thing to do, but you have to do it. It's part of your job if you're going to be involved in conducting investigations, is weighing who you think is being more credible in a situation. Sure. Sure. So yes, typically we would not, if a rumor came in, I wouldn't go directly to the staff member. I would try to see what other information I have. Is there anything else in the personnel file? Do I know anything else about this person? But if there's really nothing else other than someone saying there is this rumor going around that Luke is doing something, fill in the blank, we would try to find out. But then, as we'll talk about during the interview process, it might not be a full-blown investigation. It might just be a follow-up with the teacher of, hey, I'm hearing this. Can you tell me anything about what's behind it? And I will tell you that sometimes what happens is that we talk to the teacher and they say, oh yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that, and I'm real friendly with the girls, and that's why they're all saying this. And then it requires a bigger conversation with the teacher about, you should not be okay that you're hearing this. Like, the fact that you're hearing this is not okay. That does not make you the greatest teacher in the world, and we actually have to do something about that now. So, but you'd be surprised how many teachers say, oh yeah, it's because I'm great and they like me so much and everybody wants to be my friend. So making sure that you follow up on that, because they're also aware of the rumors, and that's problematic in and of itself. So general principle for conducting employee interviews. So for those of you who are involved in it, the first thing we want to do with the employee is explain the purpose of the interview. This is not gotcha. This is not SVU. This is not, we do not want to go in there. I used to say Perry Mason, but then I think some of you are too young to even know who that is, so I won't say that. Making sure that you explain to them, why are you there? Now, it might not necessarily be throwing everything on the table, but just generally, there has been a report of inappropriate conduct in your classroom with respect to how you are interacting with a number of students, or comments that you've made in class, or how you were treating people on the football team, and whatever it is, generally letting them know what the nature of the allegations are so they don't feel defensive immediately upon coming in. Stressing the importance of learning of all the facts surrounding the investigation. So while we should not have to say to adults, tell me the truth or you will get in more trouble, you actually have to say that to the adults. Like, if you are not honest with me, your dishonesty could lead to more discipline than the conduct you are alleged to have engaged in. I cannot tell you how many times people just lie because they think it'll be the easier way out. And the fact that they have lied is significantly worse and results in worse discipline than if they just said, hey, yeah, this is what happened in the classroom. So, but making sure that you are upfront about that from the beginning. We also tell that to kids, but you would expect to have to do that, not necessarily to our adult employees. Discussing confidentiality. This means two things. This means, one, letting the person know who you're asking the questions of that you won't necessarily be able to share with them the results of what happened in the investigation. Now, this is more for people who are witnesses necessarily, and perhaps the complainant. The accused obviously will know what happens in the investigation, but just saying, I might not be able to share exactly what happens. But also, do not discuss our conversation with other employees. Like, do not go and do not for sure discuss this with other kids. And if it's the accused who's done something allegedly with a child, a student, the dictate usually is do not speak to students during the course of your administrative leave, and certainly do not speak to any students about the allegations. But being really clear up front that they're also not expected to kind of go back to their classroom and tell the teachers in the classroom next to them, Luke just called me about this investigation, and it's a claim that Chris did something, and we want to make sure we're telling them, you are expected to behave as a professional, and I'm directing you to not go around talking about this investigation because it could impede our ability to move forward. Ensure the employee has necessary representation. So by law, if a teacher or a staff member is just a witness, there's a witness, they're not accused of done anything wrong, they don't legally have to have the right to union representation there because discipline might not be imposed on them. However, they often feel more comfortable when they have someone there to help them. So if they say, I want Max to be there, or I want one of our ETC reps to be there, one of our past reps to be there, you have really good union folks. I do think you can trust most of them to behave themselves in meetings and not go around talking about it. So sometimes it is just easier, and you'll get more cooperation from them if you actually have someone else present. And sometimes some of your teachers will say, I don't need anyone there, I can tell you what happened. So just making sure that you're being mindful of that. If they ask for an attorney, I want to bring in a private attorney, please call Luke right away. Big red flag, we'll take care of that. But no, they do not have the right with you and an attorney to come in during this meeting. So just making sure you're aware of that. The complainant interview, so the person who comes in to complain about something that's occurred. First, if someone comes in and they just verbally tell you that something happened, you want to attempt to obtain a written complaint. It's really most helpful for you if you can actually get them to put down in writing, not necessarily a full-blown narrative, but just kind of, this is generally the complaint that I'm making. So you have something to kind of start the investigation off with. As I mentioned before, not promising confidentiality. So for instance, if the complainant says, someone did this to me in school, or this custodian is pinching my butt every time I walk past him or her in the lunchroom, but I don't want you to do anything about it. I don't want you to tell anyone. I just want you to know. You can't say, okay, I won't do anything about it. You have an obligation to come and conduct some form of investigation, or at least let HR know. But the fact that they have making sure that they know that up front, but also making sure that to the extent that they're concerned about it, you ask why. Why are you concerned about my looking into this? Why would you have come to me? I can't stop it. I can't do anything about this unless I actually do something about it. And making sure that they understand there cannot be any retaliation against them, because that's usually what the fear is that that person that they're complaining about is going to retaliate. So making sure that you also say, if there's any retaliation related to what you're telling me happened, make sure to come report that back to me as well. So if anything negative's happening to you as a result of that. Finding out what the desired outcome is. Something really gets overlooked when you're talking to a complainant is, what do they want to happen? And that sometimes really helps guide what the outcome of an investigation is, not necessarily the investigation itself. But are they just looking for the person to be reminded of your sexual harassment policy? Are they hopeful that they get transferred to another building? Can they not be in the same room as this person? Making sure you understand we can't necessarily give them what they're asking for, but to have an understanding of what it is they're looking for. Finding out who else has knowledge, who else may have witnessed the event, and explaining kind of what the next steps are going to be in terms of your investigation. The accused interview, so the person who's alleged to have done something wrong, interviewing them as soon as possible after the complaint comes in, to the extent that you can do all those other preliminary steps that we talked about, making sure that they do have the right to union representation. That does not mean the union has to be there. They can say, no, I don't want the union here. They have the right to do that. As I mentioned, generally describing the allegations so they have a sense of kind of what they're responding to, stressing confidentiality, that they too should not be going out and talking to other teachers about this, about the claim, about the investigation. The one exception to that is them talking to the union about that. We do have to allow them, obviously, that discussion because of the representation issues, to allow the union to represent them. Telling them also there can be no retaliation against this person. So do not do anything toward this person or have perhaps no contact with this person to make sure that there is not any sort of claim of retaliation. And again, explaining the next steps to that person as well in terms of kind of when you'll be following up with them in the next steps and potentially having another interview or whatever that the case may be. It depends. I often do not. The allegations of misconduct or a report has come in that we need to talk to you about. As much as I said I want to make sure that it's not a gotcha moment, I also don't want people to be able to plan ahead a BS story. Yeah, but I'm not usually very specific. It's so important to see someone's reaction to something. I have to tell you, as an investigator, wearing masks, really, really tough. Because they would say like, well, my instinct is I want to be in person. It's so much better to do an investigation, but we were all wearing masks and I couldn't see people's faces. So then it turned into, let's do this over Zoom because I need to be able to see their reactions to the questions I'm asking. So to your point, you really do want to get them, their initial reaction to something. It can often be quite telling in terms of kind of what really happened. So interview techniques. I think some of this is really self-explanatory. I just put it up here as a reminder and some talking points. Listening carefully and following up on any hints or contradictions. And again, that's not I gotcha, you lied, you said this earlier, but just being really mindful of following up on anything that they've contradicted so that you make sure you understand the full story. Avoid discussing theories or assessments with the person who you're speaking to, whether it's the complainant, the accused, or someone else who you're interviewing. Don't begin with hostile or embarrassing questions. There are often hostile and embarrassing questions. There are often embarrassing questions that have to be asked, but you certainly should not start with them. That gets things off on the wrong foot. Move through events chronologically to the extent possible. That helps everyone kind of keep things in the right time frame and mindset in terms of moving through them that way. And in terms of the facts that are being given to you, making sure you really understand what the employee is saying and not assuming that you understand. So making sure that you understand kind of what was happening in that instance that they're reporting to you. Distinguishing between personal knowledge and hearsay. There are so many times where a person you're interviewing might say, I heard Shelley say X. And then you actually dig down into it. It's not they actually heard Shelley say something. They heard someone say that Shelley said something, and making sure that you are really clear with them by asking questions of, when did she say it? Where were you when she said it? Things like that can help you certainly validate whether that person heard it or whether it was coming from another source. Asking open-ended questions, not rendering explicit or impact judgments. Watch your body language. So, so much of what we do is done by how we portray ourselves and how we react to things. For those of you who have ever been in a bargaining session with me, I have really bad facial expressions that I've been working on about how I respond when people say things. So that's a perfect, I'm aware, and Zoom, oh my gosh, made me really aware of how, my God, my face looks like that when someone says something. So you all should be trained at that now because we did it for so long, but really being mindful of that because that causes someone to shut down really quickly if you are looking at them like I think you are just totally lying to me. reviewing the notes at the conclusion of the interview, making sure that you have that person understanding, like, this is what I heard you say. Is this accurate? And making sure that you clarify if it's not accurate. If they change part of their story, like, oh no, that didn't happen at 6, that happened at 10, don't erase 6 or delete 6, depending on how you're taking your notes. Make an entry in the notes later. Shelley said it happened at 10 instead of at 6. That can be really important for an investigation. So making sure that you're not going back and changing what you originally wrote. And then the last piece, ask if there's anything else they want to tell you. You will not believe the information you can get because you think you've asked and written down every best question to ask them. And if you just ask them, is there anything else you want to tell me? Sometimes you get a lot more information. And that applies for if you're interviewing kids or employees. I think that's a really important piece of that. This does feel a little bit more like, police investigations and Perry Mason in terms of kind of for each block of time, but just kind of generally going through and making sure you've hit all of these points in terms of, what was happening, who else was there, where did it occur, all of those types of questions. These questions get more at the heart of perhaps the substance in terms of what that person is going to be able to share with you about the actual incident. So in that person's perspective, could the incident have been avoided depending upon what it was? Were there other people around who witnessed it? Was this an isolated event or is there part of a pattern? So perhaps they're telling you one thing and they have not told you yet that this has been occurring over and over. So making sure that you're being mindful of asking those types of questions. Who did they discuss the event with? Like, you want to know how big the universe is. Like, did they talk to the entire 8th grade team about this? Or is it something they've just told their co-teacher? Have they told no one about what happened? So that could also be helpful in dictating your investigation. And then the last piece, are there any notes that they've taken? Has someone written down something that occurred? So for instance, someone says to you, a month ago she did this, last week she did this, and you interview the accused and they say, I didn't do that. I wasn't even here on the day that she's alleged to have had that. Do either one of them have notes corroborating that? Because, many people do take down notes. I have some plaintiffs in lawsuits who literally have written down everything that's ever happened to them in their day, and they come with like these giant, pamphlets of notebooks of information. So just ask, because you would be amazed at what people might have in their either calendars digitally or for those of them who still have paper calendars or paper notes that they take. So difficult witnesses, you're always going to have some who don't want to be there. And just in terms of making sure that you get the most information that you can from them as well, explaining that the interview is their opportunity to relate their version of the events. Sometimes helps to put the person at ease as to why that they're there. That failure to cooperate can result in discipline. Obviously, you want to do that very gently, but hopefully if the union is involved, they can help us with that as well, that someone can't just come in and kind of refuse to cooperate. You can give them a directive to answer your questions, and they can be disciplined for failing to do that. Seeking union assistance, as I just mentioned. A Garrity warning is something that only Luke and I would do. That relates to someone who's been alleged to have engaged in criminal conduct. As an arm of the state, technically, we can allow someone to kind of say that they are going to tell us what happened. We are not going to report that then to law enforcement. It can't be used against them. I will tell you that this is a law that the police think is crap. So but this is not something we can actually enforce ultimately, but we do this in certain circumstances. So if someone's alleged to have done something criminally, we make a decision if they have a lawyer to be able to say to them, either you tell us what happened and we will agree that it can't be used against you criminally, or we are going to fire you. And sometimes the person says, well, then fire me, because their lawyer says, let them fire you, because don't tell them, because they understand the police are going to say, this is not applicable here. And the Luke cannot actually tell someone they can waive their rights. So we just want to be careful about that. But just in case you ever hear what a Garrity warning is, that's what it is, a warning from the employer, the public employer, that anything they say cannot be used against them criminally if they choose to share the information with you. Student witnesses, to the extent that they are involved, just some high-level pointers here, making sure that you remember that all of your interview notes are student records, so being mindful of that. We often, and one of the notes I'll have later is using initials and not actual full names on interview notes for kids, as long as you know somewhere else where that is. So often we do kind of student A, B, C, D, E on the actual notes, and then somewhere else we keep a log of who student A, B, C, D, and E are. Students graduate and move. So I have had a number of teacher dismissal hearings where, first of all, they take a really long time, and I'll get to that at the very end here. Years. They can take years to litigate, and kids move. And then we have, they're the key witnesses in a case, and making sure that you get all the information you can from them, especially if they're, juniors or seniors, that they are going to be graduating and moving on, and that they could be a central part of an investigation, just being mindful of that. Including parents where appropriate, especially if they're little kids, but even for high school age children, to the extent that you are asking them provocative questions or about something that they might know, making sure that you're working with the student as well as any sort of service provider so if there's a counselor that can help you or a social worker, that's not necessarily on the teacher to decide how to handle that, but making sure that you're making the student most comfortable. Inviting a known staff member, if possible, to the student if that makes them more comfortable to talk to you. And then in the last point, explaining the importance of truth and confidentiality. Obviously, we wanted to do that with adults, but definitely with the kids as well. They may or may not listen, but in terms of making sure that they're knowing that they should tell you the truth and they should not also be going out and talking about the situation to their other classmates. Top interview mistakes. Questions that are evaluative, so making a judgment in the question that you're asking or leading them to a specific answer. Long, confusing questions. You will definitely not get the answer that is going to be helpful for you if you don't keep them kind of short and succinct. Sticking blindly to a script. So I think it's always a good idea to write out some questions that you want to ask and some general topics that you want to make sure you cover, especially if it's a lengthy interview or the person's particularly talkative or it's going on for a really long time, that you don't miss something. But for those people who feel more comfortable writing out the actual questions they're going to ask, sticking blindly to that and not asking a follow-up question on something that was shared often results in you kind of missing something important. So making sure that you don't do that. Interrupting and rushing, making sure that you allow enough time for the interview to take place to really get all the information that that person can share with you. So completing the investigation. And this is kind of what I was talking about judgments. The investigation could just be as short as you hear the rumor in the school, you look in the personnel file, there's nothing else there, you have a follow-up conversation with the teacher. Like, this is what I'm hearing. Any reason why? Do you have Shelly at your house on the weekends? Yes, she babysits my kids. Okay, well, this is why it's problematic that she's doing that, because the other kids think something else is going on, and that's why she got an A on her paper, et cetera, et cetera. Reaching a conclusion that I do not believe that that teacher did anything wrong. Might not be greatest professional judgment, and I've now talked to him or her about that outside interaction with that student, but I'm reaching the conclusion that there is nothing nefarious happening there between the two of them. Making a credibility determination, as I talked about before, is that, who is being more truthful to you with respect to the investigation and the interviews, and that is a job that is often hard to do, to be the one to say, I think that you're being truthful and you're not being truthful, but you have to be prepared to do that if you're going to engage in investigations. Determining early on what type of documentation is needed. There should never be an investigation that is not done without some paper trail of some sort that you did something. And what that looks like and where that goes depends a lot on the allegations as well as the conclusion that's reached. But you should not have nothing to show for it if someone came back to you later and said, I heard last year that this teacher was alleged to have done something. You're like, oh yeah, I looked into it, there was nothing. And then you have no paper trail whatsoever to say, yes, I did this. Even if it's an email to the teacher scheduling the meeting, and then a follow-up email to the teacher saying, thank you for meeting with me. As we discussed, in the future, please be more mindful of having students to your house, et cetera, et cetera. Make sure there's parental approval, whatever it is. That's not a letter of reprimand. That's not disciplinary action, but it's some paper trail to show that you did something in response to those allegations. So that's just kind of one example that you could do. Who should be notified? So like I said before, if it's something that if Luke needs to be notified, if you have other teachers in the building who might need to be notified, that would, depending on what the allegations are, but making that determination before the investigation is complete. And then determining the appropriate action that needs to be taken. So is that just an email to the teacher? Is there some sort of disciplinary action? Is it a counseling letter? Is it something you're just going to note for your file and put in domain 4 when their evaluation comes up? Like, what are you going to do? And then assessing for yourself is, does that action solve the problem? Is what I'm doing enough to address whatever the problem was that was presented to you? And you're trying to weigh that for yourself. Does legal need to be involved? That is something that, if you contact Luke, he'll obviously let me know. That's usually my point of contact is someone from the central office. Avoiding emails is, in terms of if you are involved in an investigation and you are conversing among yourselves about, so if there's a principal and assistant principal involved, or if it's Luke and one of the principals involved in an investigation, to the extent that you are not discussing theories and going back and forth about the allegations and who you think is being truthful and not truthful, via email, really important that you either pick up the phone or come down to the central office and talk to each other, because in the event that turns into litigation of any kind or a dismissal process, all of that is part of discovery, which means that teacher ultimately gets that teacher's lawyers ultimately get that. So we want to be careful that, especially if it's anything remotely high profile, that you do not send a number of emails about it that could ultimately be used against the district. And then following up with the complainant and the accused. What that means is that if someone comes into you and complains about something that a fellow colleague has done, and you look into it and you decide that maybe the situation didn't occur exactly like the person perceived it to have occurred, following up with the complainant and saying, I've looked into this, I have taken steps to ensure that this type of behavior does not occur again. And you don't necessarily have to tell them what that is, nor should you, but that you've taken steps. And then adding, and if it happens again, or if you feel there's any retaliation because you complained about it, please let me know right away. And that is helpful, that if they later claim retaliation and they have not reported it to you at the time, that we're able to rely on that and say, you were told at the time to come report it and you did not. Equally important is following up with the accused. So if someone is accused to have done something and you've met with them, even in the conversation we talked about, the rumor, and you met with the teacher, if you then meet with the teacher and they say, I didn't do that, or that's not how that occurred, and then you have no follow-up with the teacher, that is not the appropriate course of action either. There needs to be something with that teacher to say, I have confirmed that this did not occur, or this did not occur the way that was alleged, or in the future do ABC. But to have nothing there kind of leaves everyone hanging in terms of for that teacher in particular, but also if there's a future allegation of misconduct, there's an issue there if you've done nothing in the file. Okay, general rules for documentation, memorializing every interview in writing, including the document author and title. So your name on the top with the date on the top, in terms of who's being interviewed and the date and time of the interview. Is your interview being done over the phone, over Zoom, in person? And that's indicating the location. The reason this is all important is that sometimes something you investigate, an interview notes you take, might not be relevant right then, but might be relevant years later. And then the person who's in charge of looking into it at that point has to try to discern what your notes are and what they're from, and you have no idea because it occurred years ago. Or you've moved on to another district and they're left trying to wonder what happened here? What is the case? And, especially with cases involving kids, I've had situations where, we have ended up in a room with a number of administrators with a piece of paper saying, I know one of you took these notes. Who did it? We have to find out who took these notes. And they're all, well, it was 4 years ago. And it's, I have no idea. Someone printed out typewritten notes and we now have no idea who took them. And that obviously was not particularly helpful for me or anyone involved in the investigation. This is really just kind of reiterating what I was just talking about. Name and date. We tell our kids that, right? Name and date at the top of the paper. I'm going to remind you all, name and date at the top of the paper, including a summary of the allegations so we actually know what we're talking about and what you were interviewing that person for. Using quotation marks to note only word-for-word statements. So if you have a habit, and I do, and I'm still a handwritten note taker for the most part because of this, but if you have a habit of using quotation marks or something that I want to emphasize, I write in all caps. We all have our own idiosyncrasies about the way we do things, making sure that you are being clear about why you're doing that, so it doesn't appear that you're using a quotation for something that wasn't an actual quote from that person. Incorporating the chronology of the events to the extent possible, full name of any person referenced during the interview. Do not include student names, as referring to that about using initials, and copying the appropriate individuals who need to know about what the information is. Referencing policies and procedures, so to the extent that you need to, and this might not be in the interview notes, this might be more in the completing of the documentation. If someone is alleged to have violated a particular policy, making sure you reference that and not just say Board of Education policy, but what policy it is. Proofread, so please make sure you do that. This is especially important in the evaluation presentation that we'll do next, is making sure that you're proofreading your work. And being timely in distributing the documentation. So if there's something you need to get back to someone, not waiting a real long time to do that. This is my silly example, but it is actually taken from true things. So this is one version of the note. So this is from Sam Scumbag, and it's in May 10th. Denies ever texting DD. She could be a drama queen, could see that in the corner. Totally irrelevant, would not look me in the eye. JY knows the truth. Follow up with IT, but likely just lying. So years later, when we're looking at this, the only thing that I think on here is important that I know, other than the facts, to the extent you can discern them, is would not look me in the eye. That's an important piece, right? You're referencing so you remember, this person would not look me in the eye when they were telling me this, because that weighs on your credibility. This idea of could see that, did that person say that, or are you saying that? Are you thinking like, oh, I know that person, she's a drama queen, I could see that happening. That would not be appropriate for the notes. Same with the bottom part. Follow up with IT, but likely just lying. Are you saying that person's lying, or is that person you're interviewing telling you that they think that person's lying? Here's another version. Now we at least have the date, so it did happen in 2014. It's not just May 10th of some unknown year. Past relationship ended poorly, and the dramatic is in quotes. So presumably that the person said that that ending was dramatic. Follow up with IT to review. Thinks he saved the emails or texts. So why is thinks capitalized? Why is it in a box? If there's a reason for it, because that's something that you do to clue yourself in on something, just making sure that you are able to tell someone what that is. But the more important concern is on the right. So I want you to imagine having to explain to opposing counsel that my administrator was actually taking good notes when on the interview notes was his list about things he needed to do later that day. So it's silly, I know, but I wouldn't be here employed if the silly things did not happen. So I just wanted to use that as an example. That concludes the investigations portion of the presentation. Do you have any questions? I know it's a lot of information. Yes.
Related to student interviews.
Yes.
At what point is our responsibility for notifying parents that we're investigating something that their child may or may not have done?
It's a great question. So for those of you out there, the question is, what point do we have to alert parents that they're investigating something their students have or have not done? It depends on what the allegations are. This is such a lawyer response. How old the kid is, and who else is involved. So typically, if you stand in loco parentis to all the kids, you have the right to sit them in a room and say, tell me about what happened, or I heard this, or were you involved in this? But depending upon the allegations, you might realize that you're not going to get as much information if the parent is not involved, but you don't want to alert a parent to something they might say, you can't interview my kid. So it's a total judgment call. There's not a legal answer to it. The optics of it can be really difficult, though, because a parent can be very upset that you interviewed their child. But I will tell you that sometimes it happens in the context of residency investigations. Like, we know a kid is going to tell us that they're not actually living here and that they're living somewhere else. You have the right to ask that kid those questions, and they're likely going to be honest with you, and then the parents are going to go crazy that you asked their kid where they were living, but you are allowed to do that. So it's more about optics and about information you're going to get from the child if their parents are not involved. So just making sure that you're all aware of kind of what your buildings and administration would kind of think is best practice with respect to that. Correct, yeah. Correct. If it's something you're going to be talking to the child about that is a really provocative subject or something of high concern that alleged to have happened to the kid, thinking it through of if you were this parent, would you want to know and be present with that child before they ask those questions? But typically best practice is you get to conduct your interviews and then let the family know that you looked into something. So just being really mindful of what those allegations are and in relation to the age of the child. Any others? All right, why don't we take a 10-minute break and then we will move on to evaluations.
Okay, team, we're going to regroup for Shelley's final presentation. Our next presentation will be on teacher evaluation and discipline. And again, I just remind everybody, if you have any questions, since we have Shelley as a captive audience here today, please ask questions. And also for anybody who may be watching live stream, we have not forgotten about you. If you have any questions about any of our 3 presentations today, send your questions directly to me and I will address them. And if I need to loop back with Shelley and Emily, I will, but I will make sure that we get your questions answered as well. I'm just going to check out here.
All right, so we'll get started. Thank you, Luke, for moving this down so I'm not reaching up. I will tell you that I loved the smoothie. I then thought there were Cheetos out there, and I was even more excited, but they are carrots. I was so excited. I'm like, I started healthy. I'm totally going to have Cheetos now. I'm just telling you that. And I loved my smoothie. All right, so I did hear one person very excited about the evaluation presentation. Never gotten that before, so awesome. Oh, I'm sorry. Tim, I know, is excited. Yes. Tim, I know, is excited. All right, so we're going to run through this. I often do these together because obviously they relate a lot in terms of kind of what can happen with respect to teacher performance generally. We talked a little bit about the investigations related to misconduct in the first part. We're going to talk about the evaluative piece as well as the discipline piece that can come either from misconduct or from evaluations. Which is kind of to differentiate between the two. If you think about the evaluation piece as coming from kind of the instructional area, so competency in the domain areas, in terms of following your evaluation tools, the rubrics, that's the evaluative piece. And then discipline, like we talked about in the last presentation, is about correcting behavior that's occurring, whether it's in the classroom or outside the classroom. We think about that as the handling it as the circumstances require as we go through and not necessarily following on some sort of prescriptive process. So again, another slide kind of saying the same thing in terms about conduct versus performance. And just noting here that the performance piece about the evaluation, I often get the question, that's why I keep saying it, that misconduct can occur in an evaluation in domain 4. We didn't used to have that in a lot of evaluations before so many districts adopted Danielson. So that is the appropriate place to put it, even if it's also documented as a discipline issue. So where do the requirements for evaluation come from? 3 main sources. The Illinois School Code really dictates the majority of how we evaluate both non-tenured and tenured teachers in Illinois. Your collective bargaining agreement only speaks to the evaluation committee, but if you're interested in reading on it, it's 4.1, I think it's C, and talks about really if there are changes to your program, your evaluation program, that needs to be jointly agreed to by this evaluation committee made up of administrators as well as ETC members. And then your evaluation program itself that has a lot of specific details as far as how you go about rating, what the different ratings for student growth as well as the other pieces, what the expectations are of the different pieces of information that are going to be brought in, and how evaluations are done. So I assume all of you who are in here are evaluators and have read that, but that's kind of where the bulk of your information comes from as to how you evaluate in this school district. So why do we evaluate? And I think the important reason about remembering this is because it is one of the most difficult things that you will do. So I am a partner at my law firm, have been for a long time. I am the worst evaluator of associates ever, even though I give trainings on how to do this, because it is so hard to tell someone that they are not doing well, especially when you know you have to kind of continue working with them. And you grow as you do it. I've been doing this for 25 years. I'm still terrible at it. I hope you are all better than I am. But even my assistant, who I had a number of years ago, I had a terrible assistant, and it was all my fault because I could not evaluate her and tell her she was not performing up to our expectations. So I know how hard it is, but I'm still here to tell you that it's important that you do this because your teachers get tenure. So it is way more important than me, because we can still fire people. You cannot that easily. So we're going to kind of walk through why this is important. So improving performance. We often forget that this is not necessarily a bad thing. We are giving people feedback. The reason we have 4 years of tenure usually in this state is because we do not believe that a first-year teacher is fantastic. They need to improve, and this is your way of showing them the areas that they need to improve in. If you can make this a positive experience, it is better for everyone. So really embracing from the onset with your teachers that I am giving this to you to help you become a better teacher. And quite frankly, if they can't understand that, I don't have a whole lot of hope for them in the long term, because everyone, especially our educators, should appreciate that we are always growing and learning and getting better. So that's what they're for. Giving timely feedback. It's a little inconsistent because your evaluations are done on such a specific schedule. So if there is something that you see that is going on in the classroom, you do an informal observation, you walk by, you see something that doesn't look great, do not wait until the evaluation to actually write something down. Or if it's not even an informal observation, if you're just walking by and you hear me screaming at my classroom and then it stops and you don't want to walk in, not waiting until a later point, but making sure you're following up. That's evaluative, saying that, I observed this is something that we cannot see in the future, or let's talk about how you can handle the situation better. Recognizing success and growth, as I just mentioned, identifying areas for growth, and lastly, most important to me, providing evidence for employment decisions. So if we're ultimately going to decide to let someone go, that we can point to this evaluation document and say, these are the areas that they've been told to improve in and have not satisfactorily done that. So I'm going to ask Luke if that's part. I don't think that that's necessarily part of your evaluation program.
It's not necessarily, but yes, though, if you hear something like that, though, the memorialization of that is what's key and important, because then you could utilize that in some of the evaluation.
Yeah. No, and again, if you think about it this way, if you walk by and you just hear someone behaving a certain way kind of one time, and it's just kind of that's what, and it's not egregious. It's just something that your tone sounded off. You don't necessarily need to follow that up, because that wouldn't necessarily be warranted in an evaluation, right? Everyone has a bad day, and maybe that's just what you saw. It was a bad day that day. But if you see it a second time, then it might be something worse. So thinking about it in terms of, if this is the only time this happened, would I need to put this in an evaluation, or would I want to put this in that person's evaluation? So thinking about it that way in terms of if you memorialize it or not. But again, there are things that people are going to do that are just kind of, you caught them on the wrong moment or wrong day, and don't necessarily need to memorialize it. So again, this goes back to kind of that judgment piece as well. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. The question on that one was in terms of, if you are going to memorialize something, or you see some conduct, you have to memorialize it for it to end up in the formal evaluation document. And we don't think it's required by your program. Some do require it, some don't. But my recommendation is that if it's just one time something, you don't necessarily need to memorialize that unless you think it is something that you would want to later include in an evaluation. If it's something you see and it's a pattern of behavior, certainly the second time or the third time you see that, you'd want to memorialize it and make sure you reference it in the evaluation. Sure.
or do they have to go through and formally answer each of the questions in the reflection form for an informal?
They have to fill out the form, but what I'm going to share while Shelley's talking is that some people might not know of the performance improvement
I've got that.
notification, and that will be helpful for all evaluators as when they notice issues like that.
Yeah, so you have something unique in your program. It's this performance notification something, and I have a slide on it because I did want to make, yeah, I did want to make you aware that you have this other piece of it. Even for districts that don't have that, though, you still are able to not necessarily follow the informal observation process, but just as we talked about, documenting a conduct you observed and sending it via email to the teacher saying, I'm summarizing the conversation we had today about your attendance, your tone, whatever it is.
So I just want to clarify. So the forms you're talking about, Melissa, for an informal that you fill out and the teacher fills out, that's to capture, my understanding is just what was seen in the observation. If you have concerns outside of that, that's what you're using this performance improvement
Correct.
form for.
Correct.
Yes.
So it's separate. So you don't use the informal
Sorry.
observation process to capture a concern. That's to capture a reflection of a single observation. Could those cross over? If you see something during the observation that's of a concern.
The reason we have the form is because 4 or 5 years ago, there was an issue at one of the schools where an evaluator saw something, and then 3 weeks later did an observation, and then tried to put that thing that happened 3 weeks ago in the observation. You can only put things in the observation
From the
actually
observation.
observed in the observation.
Okay.
That's why the form
That's
is
why
developed.
this performance
That's what I was trying
improvement
to clarify. Thank you.
notification will be helpful to address things like Anna brought up
Right.
earlier.
Okay, so talking just back, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So the performance improvement document that's attached to it, is it only for teachers that are in like those bottom 2
No.
categories, or you can use it?
You can use it for,
No, this is
so
for anything.
the question was, should this notification form that is later in the presentation just be used for those teachers who are in the bottom categories? The answer is no, it can be used for any teacher who you observe something concerning about.
And then if you want to use it as part of your summative, you can tell Ed, there's a place to attach documents, you would attach the document as part of their summative.
Can anybody do that form even though they're not their primary evaluator? Or is it just the primary evaluator? Primary or
Got it.
secondary evaluator? So if we go through and see something, we then would have to talk with the building principal and then they would make the decision. But if they didn't
Talk to the
observe it,
supervisor.
if they didn't observe it, can they still?
It can still be part of it. It can still be a concern form can still be created. It's just who has to create it. Okay. So the evaluation, if you think about the evaluative document, when is it going to be most effective? If it identifies what the problem is, if there is a problem, why is it a problem? So not just kind of what is a problem, kind of why you are seeing it impact students or impact their relationship with others. So identifying why it's the problem, what correction is needed, so what they need to do to correct the behavior, and what you can do or what you believe the teacher can do to provide support to aid in that correction. So if you think there's something that they can do, if they can observe another teacher doing A, or if they can review someone else's lesson plans. I mean, depending on what the issue is, identifying what they can do to help them correct the problem. So the evaluation plan, as I mentioned, you have a program here and it's lengthy, so I recommend that kind of everyone look through that. It's making sure that you're adhering to those rules so you don't miss a deadline or use a process like we've just been talking about, that it should be used with a different process based on what your program is. And for those of you who've come from different districts, I especially, make sure it's important that you read through that because every district does this a little bit differently. So knowing what District 205 does, and then taking time and care with your product. You want to remember that this document should be able to be understandable to someone who's not an educator, because ultimately if there is, I hate that I think this way, but if there's a dismissal down the road and we have to go to a hearing on it, those hearing officers are not educators. So being able to, that they can look at it and say, I understand why this was a problem for this teacher. So here's your timeline. This is from your program documents. September 16th, goals reviewed with the evaluator. September 23rd, self-assessment is submitted. September, October, the observations begin. January 20th, another self-assessment is submitted. And then summative conferences are held by February 24th. Does anybody know why February 24th is an important date? Okay, so RIF decisions have to be sent out by the board in March. which is why we cannot blow this deadline. So if you've got somebody who you are concerned about, making sure that you do their evaluations first so that you can get the information to Luke for your non-tenured teachers that this person is going to be non-renewed. So non-renew and RIF decisions both have to occur. RIF is not as common because that is something that is a different process than the honorable dismissal list. Ratings still count, but it's the rating from the prior year that counts. But with respect to non-tenured teachers who are in probationary status, making sure that you do not blow this deadline so we can make decisions as we need to for non-renewals. Was there a question? So there's a question being asked that I do not know the answer to. I will admit, not a legal question, but how you process in terms of data and when you review it. So I am going to either let someone answer it or we are going to get back to them with an answer. What do you think?
Yeah, that student growth, that's not part of their evaluation. The student growth that's part of their evaluation is the parent student growth measures.
And is there a different process, and maybe for a different time, but is there a different process I should talk to people about?
Yes.
I know young guys, yes, this year I had that competition when I did the core goals competition.
The goals for the subsequent year.
Right, gotcha, okay, thank you.
So we can collect what current practice is and then identify any norms we want to do. But I don't have a pulse on how everyone talks about their different data points. And so we'll just reach out to principals, talk to them, and then Lori will get back to you with a kind of common how to work with it.
There's going to be more information for those of you listening coming out related to how you're going to look at data. All right, so let's talk about your evaluation of your probationary teachers. I think as most of you know, tenure is awarded after 4 years typically. Over the course of the last 10 years, however, there's been a change and it is now can be awarded after 3 years and in some unique circumstances after 2 years, depending upon if the teacher was tenured in a prior district and certain other circumstances apply. The reason this is important that you understand this is that if you have a new teacher to your building and they will have the accelerated tenure, so if they will have the 2 years count if they get 2 excellent ratings, you need to make sure you know that because obviously once someone gets tenure, different process, much more difficult process for dismissal. So I think that, and I'll follow up with Luke on this, I think to the extent that we have any of those teachers that notice should go out to principals or their evaluators so you know kind of upfront as to who you are possibly looking at to get tenure that quickly in your buildings. It's not common because obviously tenured teachers don't leave typically from one district to another once they have tenure, although it is becoming more common now with the teacher shortage, but just making sure that you understand that it is no longer just a 4-year process as it was 10 years ago. Obviously, they must be evaluated each year. Their ratings determine their grouping in the sequence of honorable dismissal. So I think most of you are too young to know this, but it used to be that just seniority prevailed in terms of how you were dismissed if there was a RIF, meaning that all your probationary teachers went first and all your tenure teachers were saved. That is no longer the case. If you have to do a RIF, it is kind of all for one. It depends on ratings as to who goes and who gets to stay. And then finally for probationary teachers, they can be dismissed for any lawful reason in years first, second, or third, or sometimes first and second, depending upon if they've already gotten the excellent ratings. And the 4th year, the only difference is that we have to provide them a reason in writing as to why they're being terminated. When I say lawful reason, it's just I often get principals saying, well, I can fire that person for any reason. And how did they file this gender discrimination lawsuit? And it's because of any lawful reason. So you can't fire somebody for based on a protected category. Just that in terms of their instruction, we don't actually have to provide them a written reason from the board. I say that, but please make sure you give people reasons. I mean, if you're going to let a probationary teacher go, it's better for them because it'll help them grow. It's better for the district because you have a documentation of why you let them go. So it's just a different procedural process as to whether the board has to actually include it in their resolution or not, which I think gets confusing for some people as to why there's that difference. Permissible reasons for dismissal. Obviously, we just talked about this, 4th year, possibly 3rd year, depending on what the final year is determined to be. Using the evaluation tool as your guide as to what's going on with them. And again, I have had probationary teachers who instructionally are fantastic and just cannot get along with their peers. That is an okay reason to let someone go, and that would obviously be in the domain 4, but they can otherwise be a fantastic teacher and you determine this is just not a right fit for the district. And then giving specific examples of deficiencies. So kind of this relating back to the evaluation piece is making sure that you are specific about the areas that they need to improve in, whether or not you're going to dismiss them or not. So even if you're going to have them there the next year and kind of give them another opportunity in their probationary status, but making sure that you are specific with them as to where they need to improve their behavior.
Does it necessarily mean that they would have received a needs improvement or unsatisfactory in that domain or in that component?
That's a great question. So no, not necessarily. So in terms of even if they got a proficient, making sure if there's some area they still need to improve in, that you include in that area that they need to improve in something. Also, the question I get often is if a teacher gets a proficient rating, can they still be non-renewed? And the answer is yes. So you can give someone, I've had teachers with excellent ratings and we still non-renew them because for something that happened outside of the evaluation instrument, it's determined that they're not the right fit for the district. So did that answer your question? Okay. So avoiding discrimination charges, making sure that the best way to do this is what I said before, is making sure you're giving people a reason as to why they are being let go, even though they legally don't have to be given a reason by the board, making sure that, not a good fit or not using standards is not sufficient. Try to be as specific as possible as to, inability to get along with colleagues, failure to remediate certain behavior, being as specific as you can to avoid a potential charge later. Tenure teachers, so they are every other year. Luke, you have not adopted the 3-year cycle yet, correct? Okay, so many districts in Illinois have adopted the 3-year cycle for tenured teachers. That requires bargaining with the ETC, which we've not done here yet, so it's still every other year, unless they receive a needs improvement or unsatisfactory, so that they get that 1 year off. They have to receive the notice at the beginning of the year if they're going to be on cycle. You can do it more frequently, and often we do with teachers who we are concerns about, even if they're getting a proficient rating. If their concerns leaving the year of their rating and it's proficient still, we might want to evaluate them again the next year. So making sure you give them that notice at the beginning of the year that you want to do that evaluation.
So they can't cite you if you do it every year as long as they get notice.
Correct. Correct. And then the importance is that their rating, because they're no longer protected by their tenure status necessarily, determines their order of seniority for dismissal in the event that the district has to do a RIF. Good question?
It's okay that we do an informal 1 year and then the formal the following year or 2-year cycle versus doing an informal and formal.
The question was, is it okay if we do an informal 1 year and a formal the next year in that 2-year cycle? I believe yes, unless Luke says no by the program. Do you know?
The documents are actually set up in Talent. So
To do it.
You can do informal whenever you want.
Informals, you can do all of them.
Right. I want to just confirm because because people were saying like when I first got here, I think it's my off year.
Right. Just
And I
because
don't
somebody,
anything, and I was like, no,
just because somebody was on cycle with the formal, the following year you can still do it.
just summative, not summative. I think is a better.
Yeah, so the notice piece that I'm talking about is just if they're getting a summative rating at the end of the year. That's the notice they have to be given, okay?
And if just for the team, if you ever want to add an informal, you just contact Dana and she can add an informal observation to that.
I have a quick question as a follow-up
So you're asking in talent ed?
Right. Which doesn't show up.
Right.
Or like instead of having, since our tenured teachers on summative cycle have a 2-year cycle.
That's something that we might have to talk to talent ed about.
That would be helpful. Instead of looking it up as under the separate.
Instead of doing a drop down, like for my tenured teachers this year, going back to 21, 22, if they just had like, if it represented a 2-year cycle, like if it was 21, 23, and the whole process was on one page.
Okay, we are having some discussion about talent ed and its capabilities that are going to follow up with all of our principals on. Not anything I can answer for you. So the rating of needs improvement, this also kind of is new to the last decade or so in terms of what we have to do here. It used to only be that we had to take action if there was an unsatisfactory rating, but now we have to do a performance development plan within 30 school days of receipt of the needs improvement. There are specific things in the law that need to be done for a performance development plan, identifying the deficiencies, developed in consultation with the teacher, taking into account the teacher's ongoing professional responsibilities, so other things that the teacher is doing. What that really means is not giving the teacher so much to do to correct their behavior that they or correct the deficiency that they can't take care of the other professional responsibilities that they're involved in. There is no procedural rules for how long it has to be. So that's different than the remediation plan that we're going to talk about in a minute. In terms of what happens at the end of it, under your evaluation program, if a teacher receives a needs improvement, the law says they need to be evaluated the next year. Your program says they need to be evaluated the next 2 years. So just so you're aware of that as well in terms of what your program requires.
Can I ask a specific about what the consultation means? Because in a previous district, we got hit on not consulting enough with the teacher and had to stop the needs improvement or the professional development plan and then like reevaluate. So what is it, like how much consultation is considered enough?
I would say sitting down with the teacher and talking through, like these are the areas of deficiency noted in the evaluation I gave you. We're going to consult on what the plan looks like. And I think that your behavior, because it's classroom management, it's a 30-day plan versus it's a instructional component that requires a longer assessment of whether you've improved your performance or not. So I don't think it's much more than that. I mean, they don't get to determine what goes in the plan or how long the plan lasts, but consultation in terms of, I think it should be 30 days. They're saying, I think I need 60 days to correct that. And you giving some weight to consideration of that. But ultimately, the decision is for the evaluator.
So the biggest thing is that you sat down with that person, that would prove that there is consultation and, maybe like
Some dialogue back and forth. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if this is the right time to say this. I think one of the things that I learned going through this type of process was like, as the evaluator, you have to demonstrate that you are giving that person so much feedback and support as a way, like, because the goal is to actually try to remediate and support them and get them to the proficient level. So if you ever get to this point where someone has a needs improvement, like you really have to prove that you're coaching them and providing support to them and giving them feedback for it to stick. If it goes further along in the process, correct?
Yes. And more so even with the remediation plan, which I know that we have been through. So he knows a lot about that feedback that needs to be given.
90-day plan lasts 355 days.
So what happens at the end of the PDP plan? A teacher who does not successfully complete the plan can be immediately moved to a remediation plan if that moves to an unsatisfactory rating at the conclusion of the PDP. So if you determine that, it's a classroom management issue and you want to see improvement in 30 days, and in 30 days they still can't get it together, you evaluate them again, you give them an unsatisfactory, we move to a remediation plan, which I'm going to talk about in one moment. And then they can be given a second PDP. There are not a lot of rules around this in terms of what it looks like. Like I said, it's like a decade old. Obviously, many districts have kind of different ways of doing this. So for those of you, again, who've been at different districts, making sure you're aware of kind of how it works here, and certainly working with the HR department. This is not something you should necessarily be doing on your own. Remediation plans you definitely shouldn't be doing on your own, so we'll talk about the importance of that. But even on the professional development plan, making sure that your central office is aware that you have a teacher who's received the needs improvement so that you can get the support that you need as to what that looks like moving forward. And if they're successful, they can return to the evaluation the following year and the year after pursuant to your program, but you don't need to do anything else special with respect to the prior needs improvement rating. If you have a teacher who you're going to rate unsatisfactory, there is a very prescriptive process in the school code that needs to be followed as to how you handle that unsatisfactory rating. And the most important thing is that we have a remediation plan which has to be implemented within 30 days of the unsatisfactory rating. There's a consulting teacher that's required, so that's different than the PDP plan. So we actually have another teacher that we choose, and the union helps us choose from outside, who's going to help participate in that process to support the teacher. That person is not going to be supporting the administration. That teacher cannot be called as a witness if we go to hearing. They're just there to support the teacher. The plan is 90 school days long, and there is an interim rating at 45 days and then a conclusory rating at the end of the 90 days. And it has to be very specific and based on data in terms of what deficiencies are and what the supports are provided. This is an example of a template. So I just wanted to demonstrate to you what we're talking about here is on the one side, you have like the teacher has not satisfactorily blank. And on the other side, the teacher must do this to remediate this activity. So what you want to think about in terms of what you want to put in this plan is if Shelley did everything in the right column, she would be deemed proficient and could be back on cycle the following year, not going into dismissal proceedings. This is a legal document, though. This is not something that you are doing on your own. It's not something Luke is doing on his own. We are all working on this together, which is why you should never rate a teacher unsatisfactory, a tenured teacher, without letting Luke know first. Like, I have a feeling I am going to be rating Shelley unsatisfactory. Let's get in place what we need to get in place for that process, because the 30 days happens very quickly, and we have to start working on that plan, getting a consulting teacher together, and the documentation related to that is a little onerous if we're doing it right. And again, this is the document that's going to go to a hearing officer in the event that we get to a dismissal proceeding. So being really careful about what that looks like. I just wanted to show you the template so you had an idea. And again, it's 20 pages long in terms of depending upon what the deficiencies are. And we get really specific, like must observe this teacher 3 times, must read this book and write a report on why they understand why this should not happen in the classroom. I mean, really specific things. So as I mentioned, the timelines are statutory and have to be followed. We can't move forward if we miss any of those deadlines. If they're proficient, so if they satisfactorily complete it, your program says that they have to be evaluated in the next 2 years. As I mentioned, consult with the district level administrator. And also the reason this is important is that if they do not satisfactorily complete the plan, so if they are deemed to have not been able to pull it together and they still get a needs improvement or an unsatisfactory, you are telling the board they have to be fired. So the school board does not have the decision to say, we think you're off. We think you're off. We think this person needs another chance. The law says they have to be fired. So you have to be able to answer to your school board as to why I put all of these recommendations for supports in place and they either did not do them or they didn't do them enough to get a proficient rating to come off this plan. And the dismissal process is expensive. It's long. It'll take up a lot of your time, administrator's time, and you have to remember that at the end of the day, you're kind of tying the hands of your school board if you go through that process. We also have an appeal process now. This is brand new. In terms of the process for a teacher to appeal an unsatisfactory rating. Go IEA and IFT, they got this through after many years of trying, and we now have it. So you have an appeal process that is made up of 3 people, a building level administrator, a district level administrator, and a teacher selected by the ETC who has to be a qualified administrator, so have gone through all the process to become a qualified administrator, who then reviews the unsatisfactory rating and makes a determination as to what that rating is, if they're going to uphold the rating, in which case it's unsatisfactory and moves forward with the remediation plan process, or that they determine that it's going to be a needs improvement rating or perhaps even a proficient rating. Have you had anyone go through the appeal process yet?
We did. It was 2 years ago. We did it.
And it went well?
It went well. So basically, because it's not really outlined, like, I mean, it is, but it isn't. So it
Mm-hmm.
By nature, evaluations are not readable, so we just make sure that like the teacher was notified. There's clear language in here along the way that performance was a concern. The administrator provided um, feedback that said this is what you have to do to get proficient, and there was consistency through the evaluation documents where it showed the same concern over time, and it wasn't improving. So, and it was very simple, and because the documents were so good, everybody, it was really like a 15-minute.
Yeah, and so the purpose of this, obviously, and I made a joke about the union, but the purpose of it is for inter-rater reliability, right? Like the one principal is going to look at this information and say, I rate this as an unsatisfactory. And you're going to give it to a different building level administrator and district level administrator and teacher who's gone through the evaluation process, and they too are going to say, yeah, I think this deserves an unsatisfactory rating. So that's the appeal process that we have now. So effective evaluations and difficult conversations. And this is what I was talking about before that I'm not great at in terms of people who actually work for me, not clients or opposing counsel, who everyone in this room knows I can have very difficult conversations with. So being honest and candid, really reflecting on yourself as to how can I do this and how can I not kind of beat around the bush with things and really be honest about what the performance issues are. Observe, meet, and document often. So if you're identifying a problem early on, whether it's a probationary or a tenured teacher, making sure that you are observing as much as you can and getting as much information as you can to be able to adequately provide them with the feedback they need and how they need to modify their behavior to improve. Offering resources. You know, the best thing that you can do if you're going to rate a teacher, especially unsatisfactory, is to be able to show that, you know, mid-year or the beginning of the year, that you identified the problem and you offered resources to that teacher to help them improve. And, you know, whether they choose to take you up on that at that time, it's certainly up to them, but being able to show that you actually had done that and given them ideas. Making your expectations really clear. Using objective language, don't rush, and no typos. The typos piece is especially important for the actual evaluation documents because I have had teachers who are dismissed for errors in things that they're doing or being sloppy about emails or sloppy about IEPs they're writing, for instance. And then the actual evaluation document from the administrator has typos in it and errors. And so moving forward with that, you have to be sure that you're really, and I know a lot of you have very heavy caseloads and that there's many evaluations you have to do, but really being mindful that you are being careful about the errors and rereading all of that. Connecting your success and connecting successes and failures to the domain, so back to the domains that you have in the Danielson model, and keeping emotion out of it. So, you know, there might be a lot of emotion felt in the course of the meeting, but making sure that in the evaluative document, it's as objective as possible and that you're keeping all emotion out of that document itself. This is going to be hard to read, but this is what Luke was talking about, the performance improvement notification. So this is something, again, that, you know, you may have had in districts that you came to from before called something different, but this is really putting the teacher on notice in this part of this formal process that they have done something that is in need of performance. So I'm just trying to, in terms of, it's a written documentation of an incident or concern that could affect a teacher's evaluation. So if we kind of think about what we were talking about, if you walk past the classroom and on 2 occasions you heard the teacher with a not great tone or yelling or doing something, and it could affect their evaluation, putting it together on this notification to let the teacher know that this is a concern that you have about their conduct. Has anybody here used the form? Okay, so we've got 2 hands up. So this is something that I think is a really important, if you want to kind of take a sample of one, making sure that you follow up with the HR about that, about what it looks like and how you can use it and how it can be helpful to you in your process for evaluating teachers. It further goes on to say notice of such concerns can be expressed in other forms such as an email exchange. So kind of what we were talking about before is shooting an email to the teacher saying, this is a summary of the conversation we had. But this is an interesting piece of your performance program, your evaluation program that does not exist in many districts, just formalizing this notion of this is how we're going to identify problems that could later come up in the evaluation. So when we're going back to the remediation plan, bless you. Using the consistent template, as I referenced, this is something that HR and I will likely be involved in. So there is a template that we used. Please don't try this on your own at home. It will not serve anybody well if you do that because it is kind of a legal document. You're only addressing the domains rated and needs improvement and unsatisfactory. So if you think about it that way, if a teacher, has rated needs improvement or unsatisfactory in one domain, not giving them corrective action or remedial activity in all domains, that's not going to be a realistic exercise for them. Or is a hearing officer later going to say, yeah, that's warranted? Using objective language, measurable goals. The exhibit is the plan itself is the central exhibit at the hearing. If we go to hearing, that's what the hearing officer is going to look at. And then lastly, and I mentioned this earlier, to ask yourself, if the teacher did everything that I told her to do related to the remedial activity, would she be then deemed proficient? And the answer to that has to be yes, showing that you've given all the supports that were needed or offered all the supports that were needed for that teacher to improve. Any questions on evaluations before we switch over to discipline for a little bit? And I know they're related. So disciplining a probationary teacher, we have the letters of reprimand for conduct issues and violations of policy. This notice to remedy concept that we're going to talk about does not apply to probationary teachers. That applies only to tenured teachers. So for probationary teachers, that can be a letter of reprimand from you at the building level, warning them about their conduct, and if they continue to engage in that conduct, they could have further disciplinary action. So that's kind of happens in the probationary teacher realm. They can certainly justify non-renewal, and sometimes serious conduct can actually result in a mid-year termination. So those are for things like incompetency, cruelty, negligence, and immorality. So different than a tenured teacher where there's a very lengthy process that has to be followed. In the event that a probationary teacher engages in that behavior, they can be terminated quite easily mid-year or given disciplinary warnings at the building level. If you are writing a letter of reprimand, because certainly that is something that I think you will all likely do, whether it's to teachers or to support staff in your building, making sure it's timely, identifying the problem, like I said with evaluations, explaining why what they're doing is wrong or the impact of that, providing clear directives on what's expected moving forward, as opposed to just saying this is wrong, telling them what they need to do to make the issue better, and providing a warning in it so that we can look back at it and say, you were warned that if you failed to do this, further disciplinary action would occur. So those are kind of the components that should be in there. And then in terms of non-renewal of probationary teachers, you really have to be mindful of this because they are likely not going to get better, right? So if you've got somebody who's kind of on the cusp in their fourth year and you're not sure, once you move over, we're going to talk about this in a moment, to becoming tenured, the process is so much more difficult to dismiss a tenured teacher that you have to be really mindful that you're making the right decision for the district long term, that we are identifying that teacher in their first 4 years and making that somewhat difficult decision but important decision to part ways with them. So dismissal of a tenured teacher. There are 3 routes to do this. If they engage in irremediable conduct, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that is, but the standard is very, very high, so cannot be remedied even with a warning. Violation of a notice to remedy, which is a final warning from the Board of Education saying if you do this again, you're going to be fired, or failure to satisfactorily complete a remediation plan under the evaluation program that we just talked about. And those are the 3 very prescribed ways that you have to go through the process to fire a tenured teacher. So tenure teacher dismissal hearings, there are 2 ways that this goes down, and it depends on if it's a misconduct issue or if it's a performance issue. If it's a misconduct issue, since 2011, there's been a change that the hearing officer makes a recommendation back to the Board of Education, and the board then gets to decide if they still want to terminate. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you think about it because they're the ones who decided to go forward with the termination to begin with. The difference is that there's a full evidentiary hearing and an independent hearing officer is making a recommendation back to the board to say, we think there's enough evidence there to terminate or we don't think there is. And the board then gets to decide on its own if they're going to still move forward. And the teacher then has the right to appeal to court. If it's a performance-based dismissal, so it's based on the evaluation plan, the hearing officer in almost all cases is making a decision and telling the school board, you have to allow this person to return or I'm upholding the dismissal. and then either side, depending on what the decision is, can appeal back to the court. But that's also why the significance of the remediation plan, because someone else independently is going to get to make this decision, ultimately not the school board, and the school board will have to expend the resources to go to court if they want to fight it. So the question was, what happens when the appeal is taking place? Do you mean the process of the appeal of the dismissal recommendation? Great question. So what the process is that a teacher is told of the dismissal recommendation from the superintendent. It then goes to the Board of Education, and they're typically placed on paid administrative leave at that time. That decision is then taken to the Board of Education, and there is a mini hearing held. It's not a full-blown evidentiary hearing. So it's Luke or Keisha making the recommendation to terminate teacher A and explaining to the board in general terms and preparing the charges that outline why the teacher should be dismissed. The teacher then has the opportunity during that closed session board meeting to make his or her presentation as to why they don't think they should be dismissed. The board then comes out of closed session into open and makes a decision and says we are upholding the dismissal or we are not dismissing this teacher. The teacher has 17 days then to file with the State Board of Education to ask them for an independent hearing officer to have a hearing. The teacher, once the board takes the action and the 17 days has expired, the teacher goes on an unpaid suspension. So it's tricky to think about because the board has technically acted on dismissal, but the teacher isn't actually fired until the end of the entire process. So the teacher stays out on unpaid suspension, and this process can take years. It's supposed to happen much quicker. I'll show you the timeline that ISB has said that it takes, but in my experience, it never is done within a year. So they stay out. At the end of it, if a court determines, for instance, that the board was wrong and that they should have not dismissed the teacher is entitled to back pay for that entire period that they were out on the unpaid leave. So the question is, do they get benefits if it's unpaid? And the answer is, Helen, if you ask me, yes. And this is why. They have to pay for their own insurance, so you don't have to pay for it. But if ultimately they have an incident that occurs and you've stopped medical and a court or hearing officer later says they shouldn't have been dismissed, it's my opinion that the district could be on the hook for that medical related expense if you did not continue benefits since they weren't technically terminated. But you don't have to continue paying for them. They can be expected to pay the entire premium. So what is irremediable conduct? What can we say to a teacher? You have done this. We are taking you to the board for termination. Like I said, very high bar, sexual misconduct, some physical conduct, not all physical conduct, some policy violations, not all, theft, illegal conduct, permanent incapacity, and cheating. So helping a student cheat on a test. Those are kind of the big ones that you can actually move forward. But like I said, there are exceptions to all of this in terms of what teachers can argue is not actually irremediable, and it's a very, very high bar. So if you have a teacher who you believe has engaged in irremediable conduct, what do? You immediately alert the district office. The teacher goes on paid leave during the course of the investigation, and then a determination is ultimately rendered by the central office as to which avenue they're going to go down in terms of, after that investigation, are they going to recommend dismissal or is the teacher going to be returned to the classroom? Yeah, so the question is if we have a specialist who is not acting satisfactory in their role, how do you handle that process of evaluation and the ultimate termination potential? And the answer is they have to be satisfactorily performing in the role for which they were hired. So we have a certified staff member. If they're a specialist or a classroom teacher, doesn't matter. The specialist doesn't go back to being a classroom teacher and evaluated then. They have to be performing in that role, and they get evaluated on that role, and the remediation plan will be based on that role. So what's remediable conduct? I told you what irremediable is. We have anger management issues, alcohol, profanity, attendance, inappropriate conduct with kids that doesn't rise to the level of real physical or sexual conduct. What do we do if we have bad conduct, but conduct that doesn't warrant immediate dismissal? That's when the notice to remedy comes in, and that is something from the Board of Education, is a notice to the teacher, you have engaged in this behavior. If you do not follow these directives related to that behavior, you will be terminated. So it's not something that can come from Dr. Campbell, it's not something that can come from you, it has to come from the board if you want to effectuate a dismissal following that for a conduct issue. I often get the question of, but for how long? How long does that stay in the file to say you have to be doing this or you can't do this anymore? If you do this again, you're going to be fired. And the answer is it always stays in there. It never comes out. How significant it is if they engage in that conduct again depends on the egregiousness of the conduct and how far removed it is from the actual notice to remedy. So just because a notice to remedy says if you ever do this again, you are going to be terminated. If it's 5 years from now, it's just kind of sort of, it's like somewhat unprofessional behavior, but not exactly the type of unprofessional behavior. Luke would call me, I would tell him, we probably do not have enough here. Now remember, since 2011, the hearing officer does not make a decision back to the board in conduct cases. The board gets to decide. So this has resulted in many more boards being willing to say like, yeah, we'll go forward. We don't want this teacher here, and we understand it's a process. But we know that the teacher is much likely to more likely to settle than they were before, so we are going to start forward with this process. So it's not as unlikely as it used to be. The other significant change, just in case any of you are curious, and I am because that's what I do, is that the other change they made is that the hearing officer used to be all paid for by the board. So the Board of Education had to pay for the hearing officer. Now, if the teacher wants a say in who the hearing officer is, they have to split the cost of the hearing officer with the board. Otherwise, they can say, we don't want to say, and the board has to pay. So that's also a big difference, is that we now get to select who our hearing officers are independently, typically without the teacher's involvement. Yep.
Regarding staff dependence, okay, so if you notice that there's a pattern, because I've seen it in different ways, handled differently. If you see a pattern of absences on a Friday, sick, you're taking sick days every other Friday, what can we do with that as far as the evaluation, with the notice of remedy?
Sure. So I think the first thing to do would be to have a meeting with the teacher, and if you saw that it was a pattern and they didn't have an actual answer for it that was acceptable to you, to initially start with a letter of reprimand, telling them that you've noticed this as a pattern and that you are directed to, be more mindful of attendance. If you really think it's a sick leave abuse issue, I think getting Luke involved early on, because we've got to make sure that we're not violating the ADA. If there actually is a reason they're out that you might not be aware of on Fridays, for instance, doctor's appointment or something like that. If you give them that letter of reprimand and they continue to be out for that period of time, continue to engage in that behavior, being out on Fridays or whatever it is that they're doing, then we can move to a notice to remedy from the board. And if that then does not effectuate the change, and that all happens much more quickly than the evaluation process, then the board can move to dismissal. But attendance cases rarely get to that point. I mean, there's a few cases out there that talk about really egregious attendance issues, but usually not that bad.
So if a staff member is sick every Friday, you have a conversation with the union rep and the teacher, and does the teacher, do they have to tell us why they were out sick? They were sick for 3 consecutive Fridays.
Well, they could say that I have a medical reason that I'm out, and that wouldn't be something that you would handle then. You would then turn it over to Luke and let him handle it, because we don't want our building administrators involved in medical issues with our teachers who you're responsible for evaluating. So if they say, I've been out every Friday, I mean, hopefully if it actually is a medical reason, they've actually taken and been approved for FMLA leave on those Fridays. So those would run at the same time. But yes, you definitely have the right to call them out on that. If a teacher's out on Friday or Monday, we sometimes have sick leave abuse is a terminable offense. So we've got the teachers who are out and then they post Facebook pictures of them on their vacation or at the Cubs game or the White Sox game if you're in my house. That can be terminable. So we could determine how is it a pattern that's happening? Did they lie to you during the course of the interview? To say that I was homesick in bed with COVID and then they've got posted pictures out there. So it really depends on the circumstances surrounding the absence. But certainly you don't have to just let it happen.
Right. So just to kind of recap it, so if they have a medical issue
Yes. Yes.
If they don't, if they just say, well, I'm just sick, then that can be noticeable.
Yes. Yes. You can say, well, I'm not suggesting that you're not being truthful. Can you see how I am concerned that every Friday you happen to have this migraine? What can we do about that, as opposed to you being absent?
I just want to make sure if it is a medical situation, someone is following up on it.
Yes, correct. That's not and you're not expected to do that, correct?
But you don't go straight notice to remedy because that's before you do the other plan that you're able to.
A letter of reprimand, right. And then if it continues, then it goes to the board for a potential notice to remedy.
And then we would hope that we don't see excellence on everybody's evaluation.
Yes. And then the last piece here is that, and this is something that you'll work with HR with, but all the administrators who supervise the teacher in any way would be put on notice of the directives and the notice to remedy. So to make sure that they were aware of the behavior that the teacher was or was not supposed to be engaged in.
If it is something that maybe they short-term fix, but then the next evaluator comes in and is trying to recognize, like, where do we note that?
Well, that would be in domain 4, but presuming you've talked to them about it before.
The most important part is that you're not addressing it during the evaluation. It was addressed prior to that.
But you can make note of it.
Right, it'd be made note of in the summative, but there'd be other supporting documentation separately related to that kind of conduct issue. So this just goes through, and I think Luke is going to give everyone a copy of the presentation just so you have it. This kind of goes through kind of what we already talked about, letter of reprimand, notice to remedy, performance evaluation, kind of who does it, what it looks like, what the consequences are. This kind of follows through what Irene was asking me about what the process is in terms of how a tenured teacher is dismissed. And if you see, it's lots of pieces of this puzzle, and that's why it takes so long. So you'll see it says 75 days from hearing officer selection, the hearing commences. That just does not happen in terms of all the other pieces that need to go before that. I often get the question of, does the teacher have a lawyer during that process? And the answer is sometimes. So the union can either decide to represent the teacher and bring in your district, the IFT lawyer, who then represents the teacher during the process, or the union can say, we're not supporting you in this, in which case the teacher has to bring in their own lawyer and pay them to go through the process. But typically they are represented if they kind of go through this. It's very much like a trial, just in front of a hearing officer as opposed to a judge or jury. All right, 11:30, I meant to be out of here 5 minutes ago. Any questions that I can help you with so I can get you on your way? I know you're all very busy. All right, thanks.